I am Zuri, 29 years old, and I literally almost died for a piece of paper. When I collapsed at my graduation, my heart failing after years of relentless stress, the emergency room doctors called my parents. They never came. Instead, as I lay hooked to a ventilator, my older sister Chloe tagged me in a photo. Finally, Paris family trip. No stress, no drama. I said nothing. Days later, still weak and surrounded by beeping machines, I opened my phone to 70 missed calls and a text from my father, Desmond. "We need you. Answer immediately." Without thinking twice, I prepared to show them exactly what I was capable of. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who treated your existence as a burden. Growing up in a wealthy suburb of Atlanta, my parents, Desmond and Patricia, cared about exactly two things: social climbing and my sister Chloe. While Chloe was groomed for elite circles and married a predatory corporate real estate developer named Preston, I was the family ghost. I spent 3 years working night shifts auditing financial records to pay for my master's degree in forensic accounting. I did not ask my parents for a single dime. They would not have given it anyway. They claimed my obsession with uncovering fraud lacked the prestige of Chloe and Preston's real estate empire. But I pushed through the exhaustion. My graduation was supposed to be my triumph. The auditorium was packed with proud families holding bouquets and cheering loudly. I stood backstage in my cap and gown, my chest unusually tight, a dull ache radiating down my left arm. I ignored it. I walked out and scanned the front row. I had reserved 5 premium seats for my family months in advance. I had practically begged my mother to come. She told me they would try to squeeze it in between their country club brunch and packing for their European vacation. As my name was called, Zuri Washington, Master of Science in Forensic Accounting, I walked across the stage. The lights were blinding. I looked down at row A, seats 1 through 5. They were completely empty. Nobody from my family bothered to show up. A profound, suffocating weight crushed my chest. It was not just the emotional devastation of being entirely abandoned on the most important day of my life. It was a physical failure. As my fingers brushed the leather cover of my diploma, my vision blurred. The polite applause of strangers faded into a high-pitched ringing. The last thing I remember was the hard impact of the wooden stage floor against my cheek and a chaotic chorus of terrified screams. I woke up to the mechanical hissing of a ventilator and the smell of an intensive care unit. My body felt like it had been crushed under wet concrete. A kind nurse noticed I was awake and checked my monitors. She gently explained that I had suffered a severe episode of acute exhaustion and myocarditis. My heart gave out from chronic stress and untreated infections. I could barely speak, my throat raw from the breathing tube they had just removed. I croaked out a question about my family. The nurse looked away, her expression tightening with deep pity. "We called your emergency contacts 48 hours ago," she said softly. "They were informed it was a life-threatening medical emergency. They said they were at the airport and could not turn back." My monitor beeped faster as my heart rate spiked. 48 hours. I had been lying in an ICU bed for 2 days, and my parents had boarded an international flight. I asked for my personal phone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the display screen. I expected frantic messages or voicemails proving I mattered. There was zero concern for my health. No texts asking if I was breathing or recovering. Instead, the very first notification was an Instagram tag from Chloe. She had posted a picture of herself, Preston, and my parents holding expensive glasses of champagne in front of the Eiffel Tower. They were all grinning, draped in designer clothes funded by Preston's shady development deals. The caption read, "Finally, our Paris family trip. Nothing beats spending time with the real achievers of this family. No stress, no drama." My own mother, Patricia, had commented right beneath it. She wrote, "So blessed to have a vacation free from negative energy. We finally have our successful family together." I stared at the screen until my eyes burned with unshed tears. Negative energy. That is what they called my near-fatal heart failure. A convenient excuse to brand me as a dramatic burden who was trying to ruin their luxury vacation. I dropped the phone onto my lap. The absolute cruelty of their indifference stripped away the last desperate hope I had ever held onto regarding my parents. They did not just favor Chloe, they actively despised my existence. I closed my eyes, trying to regulate my breathing, before the medical alarms triggered again. Then the heavy door to my hospital room groaned open. I braced myself, expecting the senior cardiologist to deliver more grim news about my slow recovery timeline, or a young nurse to draw more blood. But it was not a doctor in a white coat. It was Grandpa Ezekiel. He was 78 years old, breathing heavily and leaning his entire body weight heavily on his carved wooden cane. His clothes were rumpled and he looked absolutely terrified. He was the only living person in the Washington family who had ever truly loved me unconditionally. And as he limped toward my bed, his eyes filled with absolute panic, I knew instantly that my graduation was not the only thing that had been destroyed this week. Grandpa Ezekiel shuffled into the stark hospital room, his breath rattling with every strained step. I tried to sit up, the heart monitor beside my bed, instantly registering my spiking pulse. I begged him to sit down, reaching out my trembling hand to pull the plastic visitor chair closer to my bed. He collapsed into it, his knuckles white as he gripped his carved wooden cane. I asked him how he got here, knowing his driver license had been revoked last year due to his failing eyesight. He looked at me with a mixture of profound relief and simmering anger. He told me he took a bus, then a cab, paying his own way across the city, because my mother had lied to him. Patricia actually called him from the airport terminal right before she boarded that flight to Paris. She told him I was just throwing a tantrum, faking a panic attack to ruin Chloe's luxury vacation. She told him not to waste his time visiting a jealous spinster who could not handle her sister's success. Hearing those words spoken aloud made the sterile room feel even colder. My own mother had tried to isolate me in an intensive care unit just to protect her precious Parisian getaway. But Ezekiel shook his head, his voice rough with exhaustion. He said he knew immediately she was lying because he knew me. I was the girl who worked 50-hour weeks analyzing corporate fraud data while studying for a master's degree. I did not fake illnesses. I worked until I literally dropped. But the terror in his eyes was not just for my health. He leaned forward, his breathing growing increasingly shallow, and grabbed my hand with a desperate grip. He said, "We did not have much time." I asked him what was wrong, why he looked so panicked. That is when the truth came spilling out, raw and unfiltered. My parents had not just abandoned me. They were using my hospitalization as a distraction to execute a hostile takeover of Ezekiel's estate. For months, Desmond and Patricia had been trying to force him into a state-run assisted living facility. They claimed he was losing his mind, but their real motive was entirely financial. Ezekiel owned a massive historic commercial block in the heart of Atlanta. It was a cornerstone of Black history, a place where our ancestors had built thriving businesses during the height of segregation. It was a symbol of resilience, and it belonged entirely to him. But Chloe's husband Preston did not care about history. As a corporate real estate developer, Preston only cared about profit. He wanted to bulldoze the entire block to build a sterile complex of luxury condos for wealthy tech transplants. Preston had promised Desmond and Patricia a massive cut of the profits if they could get Ezekiel declared legally incompetent. They wanted to strip him of his rights, seize the power of attorney, and hand the deed over to Preston's firm, Vanguard Developments. Ezekiel's voice cracked as he explained how Preston's private security thugs had already started harassing his longtime tenants. They were threatening to double their rent and citing fake building code violations. They were trying to starve the community out before the ink on the demolition permit was even dry. My blood ran cold. The sheer audacity of their greed was paralyzing. They were destroying our family legacy to finance their designer lifestyles and social climbing ambitions. Ezekiel reached into his heavy wool coat, his hands trembling violently, He pulled out a heavy antique brass key attached to a faded leather strap. He pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers tightly around it. The metal was warm from his body, heat heavy with a significance I was only beginning to understand. He told me this key opened his private floor, safe in the back office of the main building on the property block. He said, I was the only person he trusted, the only one who possessed the sheer intellect and the moral backbone to fight Preston on his own terms. He knew my forensic accounting skills were the exact weapon needed to dismantle Preston's shady corporate structures. I looked at the key then back at my grandfather. His skin was turning an alarming shade of gray, and a sheen of cold sweat had broken out across his forehead. I pleaded with him to let me call a doctor, but he gripped my wrist with surprising strength, anchoring me to his words. He looked directly into my eyes, his chest heaving irregularly as he fought for every single breath. He gasped out his final command, his voice echoing in the quiet space. He told me I was the only one who could stop the demolition, the only one who could save our history from being erased by their ruthless greed, before I could promise him that I would fight them to the bitter end. His eyes suddenly rolled back. His grip on my wrist went completely slack, his hand slipping off the edge of the mattress. Ezekiel slumped forward, his chest seizing in a massive cardiac arrest. He collapsed onto the linoleum floor with a sickening thud, his wooden cane clattering loudly across the room. I screamed his name, tearing at the intravenous lines taped to my arms. The heart monitor attached to my own chest began to shriek a frantic, high-pitched alarm that mirrored the utter chaos erupting in my room. I scrambled to the edge of the bed, crying out for help. Watching helplessly as the only man who truly loved me lay motionless on the cold hospital floor, while the medical monitor's flatlined nurses sprinted through the open door, pushing a crash cart past my trembling frame. I was shoved aside, clutching the antique key to my chest like a shield. In that frantic blur of defibrillators and desperate shouts, I made a silent, unbreakable promise to destroy the family that did this. The days that followed dissolved into a sterile nightmare of beeping machines and hushed medical jargon. I was finally taken off the supplemental oxygen, my lungs burning with every breath of the dry hospital air. But my physical exhaustion was nothing compared to the crushing weight in my chest. Down the hall in the cardiac intensive care unit, Grandpa Ezekiel lay in a medically induced coma. The doctors offered no promises. They simply told me his heart had sustained catastrophic damage and that the next few days were critical. I spent hours staring at the ceiling, my fingers endlessly tracing the cold, heavy brass of the antique key he had pressed into my palm. It was the only tangible proof that his desperate final words had not been a hallucination. He had trusted me with his legacy, and I was trapped in a hospital bed too weak to even stand without my knees buckling. It took 3 days before I could muster the energy to retrieve my personal phone from the plastic belongings bag the nurses had tucked into the bedside table. I expected maybe a handful of messages from coworkers or my landlord. Instead, the screen illuminated with a barrage of notifications that made my blood run cold. There were exactly 70 missed calls. Not a single one was from a concerned friend or a doctor. They were all from my mother, my father, and Preston. 70 attempts to reach me, and not a single voicemail asking if I was recovering from the heart failure that had nearly killed me on my graduation day. Not a single text inquiring if Ezekiel had survived his massive cardiac arrest. I opened my message inbox, my thumb hovering over the screen. The texts from my father Desmond read like frantic corporate directives. The first one arrived the day after my collapse. It said, "Call your mother back immediately. You are causing unnecessary delays." The second text, sent 12 hours later, was even colder. "Your sister is extremely stressed by your lack of communication. Stop being selfish and pick up the phone." But it was the most recent text, sent just 20 minutes ago, that made my stomach twist into tight, painful knots. "We need you. Answer immediately. The notary is waiting." The notary? The word echoed in my mind, confirming every paranoid fear Ezekiel had gasped out before his heart stopped. They were not waiting for me to recover. They were waiting for me to sign away his life. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of my father's text, my phone vibrated violently in my hand. It was an incoming call from my mother, Patricia. I stared at her name flashing on the screen. The woman who had birthed me, the woman who had spent my entire childhood treating my existence like a stain on her perfect socialite record, was calling. I pressed the green button and brought the phone to my ear, bracing myself for whatever fresh cruelty she had prepared. I did not even get a chance to say hello. My mother's voice snapped through the speaker, sharp and impatient, completely devoid of any maternal warmth. Finally, Patricia barked, her tone dripping with intense irritation. Do you have any idea how much time you have wasted? Preston has had a team of lawyers sitting in a conference room all morning, billing us by the hour. I need you to get out of that hospital bed right now, pull yourself together, and take a cab to Vanguard Development's headquarters. I closed my eyes, a bitter laugh dying in the back of my throat. I told her I was just taken off oxygen. I told her Grandpa Ezekiel was in a coma down the hall fighting for his life. I wanted to hear it. I wanted to hear her acknowledge the reality of the devastation she and Desmond had caused. Her response was a heavy, dramatic sigh. Please do not start with the theatrics today, Zuri. We are dealing with very high-level real estate acquisitions, and your little hospital stay is incredibly inconvenient for everyone's schedule. Ezekiel is old, and these things happen. But business does not stop. We have a routine document that requires your signature to release his assets and finalize his transition into the care facility. It is just standard paperwork. Get down here and sign it so Chloe can stop worrying and enjoy the rest of her vacation. Routine document. The lie was so blatant, so dripping with manipulative venom, that it ignited a spark of pure, unadulterated rage deep in my chest. The exhaustion that had pinned me to the mattress vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. I had spent my entire life biting my tongue, absorbing their insults and shrinking myself to accommodate their massive egos. But listening to her casually dismiss my near-death experience and Ezekiel's coma as mere inconveniences to her luxury lifestyle changed something fundamental inside me. I am not signing anything, I said, my voice steady, stripped of any emotion. I am not coming to the office, and I am certainly not handing over Grandpa's property to fund your delusions of grandeur. Do not call this number again. I moved to end the call, but before I could pull the phone away, I heard a scuffle on the other end of the line. The audio muffled, followed by the sound of a heavy door clicking shut. When the voice returned, it was no longer my mother's shrill, demanding tone. It was Preston. His voice was smooth, calculated, and dripping with the kind of smug arrogance that only a wealthy, entitled corporate predator could manage. Listen to me very carefully, Zuri, Preston said, dropping all pretense of familial warmth. I know you think you are playing some noble hero right now, protecting the old man's junk property, but you are way out of your league. You are a broke, unemployed accountant with a mountain of student debt. You do not understand how the real world operates. I gripped the brass key in my hand, letting the sharp edges press painfully into my skin to keep myself grounded. I told him I understood exactly how fraud operated. I told him he was never going to touch that property. Preston chuckled, a low, menacing sound that sent a chill down my spine. That is where you are wrong. Since you want to play hardball, let me explain your new reality. The old man is in a medically induced coma. His daily intensive care bills are astronomical. Your parents certainly are not going to pay them, and we both know you cannot afford a single day of his treatment. If you do not sign this release form and transfer the deed control to Vanguard Developments, I will personally have my legal team petition the court to hold you solely financially liable for every single penny of his medical debt. I will bankrupt you. I will garnish your wages for the rest of your miserable life. I will take everything you ever try to build. He paused, letting the heavy, suffocating threat settle over the line. So you are going to get out of that bed, Preston commanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, dangerous whisper. You are going to walk into my office, and you are going to sign the paperwork. See you in an hour. The line went dead. The dial tone echoed in the silent hospital room. I slowly lowered the phone, my heart pounding a furious rhythm against my ribs. Preston thought he had trapped me. He thought he could use my love for Ezekiel as a weapon to force me into submission. He assumed I was just a weak, easily intimidated girl who would fold under the threat of financial ruin. He had absolutely no idea that by threatening me, he had just handed a forensic accountant the ultimate motivation to audit his entire existence. I did not get out of that bed. I did not pull myself together. I stayed exactly where I was, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, clutching my grandfather's heavy brass key so tightly my palm bruised. Preston had given me an hour. I gave him 36. That is exactly how long it took for their precious Parisian getaway to crumble into an emergency transatlantic flight. The heavy wooden door to my hospital room swung open with enough force to bang loudly against the wall stopper. In marched the Washington family, fresh off a first-class flight from Charles de Gaulle. They looked like a walking advertisement for duty-free luxury. My mother, Patricia, led the charge in a pristine cream cashmere coat, completely unbothered by the sterile hospital environment. My father, Desmond, trailed behind her, checking his expensive watch with a sharp click of his tongue. Chloe strutted in wearing oversized designer sunglasses indoors, carrying a massive crocodile skin tote bag. Preston brought up the rear, his tailored suit miraculously devoid of any travel wrinkles. Not a single one of them looked at the heart monitor tracking my fragile pulse. Nobody asked if the doctors had cleared me to sit up. Nobody asked if I was still experiencing chest pains. Nobody even bothered to ask if Grandpa Ezekiel had opened his eyes. They simply surrounded my bed like vultures circling a very inconvenient obstacle. Chloe marched straight to the side of my mattress. She unzipped her massive tote bag, pulled out a dense, aggressively stapled stack of legal documents, and dropped them directly onto my legs. The heavy thud sent a shock of pain through my bruised ribs. She pulled off her sunglasses and glared down at me. "Your little stunt cost us our private tour of the Louvre, Zuri." Chloe sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "So let us wrap this up quickly. The private car is waiting downstairs to take us back to the airport." I stared at the massive stack of paper resting on my hospital blanket, then looked up at my family. I asked them if they possessed even a shred of human decency. I reminded them that their own father was fighting for his life down the hall, and that I had nearly died on a graduation stage just days ago. "My father?" Desmond scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "We do not have time for your dramatic victim routine today, Zuri. We are here to fix the mess you and that stubborn old man created. You are holding up progress." Preston stepped forward, placing a manicured hand on Chloe's shoulder to calm her down. He looked at me with that same predatory smile he used to charm venture capitalists. "Let us be realistic here, Zuri," he said, his voice slick and patronizing. "You are sitting on a mountain of student loans for that little accounting hobby of yours. You do not have a job. You do not have actual assets. The intensive care unit is billing your grandfather $10,000 a day. That is a brutal financial reality you simply cannot fix with a calculator and a spreadsheet. But my firm can. Vanguard Developments is prepared to absorb every single medical bill. We will ensure Ezekiel gets the best palliative care available until he passes. All we need is your signature on those release forms." I pushed the documents away, the thick paper sliding down the sterile white blanket. I asked them why they needed me at all. If Desmond had secured a fraudulent power of attorney like Ezekiel suspected, my signature should have been entirely irrelevant. They should have been able to bulldoze the historic Atlanta block without ever stepping foot in my room. My mother's face contorted with absolute fury. Her manicured nails dug into the leather of her handbag. "Because my senile father went behind my back," Patricia hissed, her voice vibrating with rage. 3 years ago, he secretly amended his living trust. He listed you as the secondary trustee for the entire commercial block. You, the daughter who has never contributed a single thing to this family's social standing. He gave you the legal power to block the sale. So yes, unfortunately, we need you to sign away your trustee rights so Vanguard can legally process the demolition permits by Friday morning." They really thought I was stupid. They truly believed that because I did not wear designer labels or attend their elite galas, I lacked the intellect to comprehend their corporate maneuvers. Preston pointed to the last page, handing me a sleek silver pen. Just sign on the dotted line, Zuri. Be a good sister for once, and let the adults handle the real estate acquisition. I did not take the pen. Instead, I picked up the heavy stack of documents. Preston assumed I would just skim the bold headings and surrender out of sheer intimidation. But he forgot who he was dealing with. I was a forensic accountant. I spent my life hunting for the invisible traps buried in financial legalese. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs, ignoring the standard release clauses and hunting for the cross-referenced addendums. I flipped through page after page, analyzing the corporate restructuring terms Vanguard Developments had drafted. Then I found it. I flipped to page 47, my finger tracing a deeply buried subclause, categorized under asset liquidation and personal liability waivers. My breath hitched in my throat. The words blurred for a fraction of a second before snapping into horrifying clarity. This was not just a property transfer. By signing this document, I was not simply handing over the historic block to Preston's firm. Buried in the complex legal jargon was an irrevocable medical and insurance waiver. If I signed my name on that dotted line, I would be legally transferring Ezekiel into a state-funded facility, stripping him of his private health care and completely waiving his right to his own multi-million-dollar life insurance policy. The contract was designed to funnel the insurance payout directly into Vanguard Developments to cover their corporate acquisition liabilities. They were not trying to pay for his medical care. They were actively pulling his life support to fund their luxury condos. I stared at the dense block of text on page 47 until the letters practically burned into my retinas. The irrevocable medical and insurance waiver. My own family was actively conspiring to turn off my grandfather's life support, seizing his multi-million-dollar life insurance policy to cover the overhead on a soulless luxury condo development. A cold, heavy silence fell over the hospital room as I slowly looked up from the paperwork. My mother was tapping her foot impatiently. Chloe was checking her reflection in her phone screen. Desmond was adjusting his silk tie. None of them had any idea that I possessed the specific forensic training to instantly decipher their financial death warrant. I dropped the documents back onto my lap. "I am not signing this," I stated. My voice was raspy but completely unwavering. "I am not signing away Grandpa's health care, and I am certainly not signing away his life insurance payout to fund Vanguard Developments." Preston let out a soft, patronizing chuckle. He smoothly stepped around Chloe, moving directly to the side of my hospital bed. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the metal bedrail, invading my personal space with the overpowering scent of his expensive cologne. His smile was perfectly practiced, the ultimate mask of the benevolent white savior swooping in to rescue the poor, confused black woman from her own ignorance. "Zuri, sweetheart," Preston began, his tone dripping with thick, suffocating condescension. "I know you have had a very traumatic few days. Your body has been through a lot, and the medication is probably making you a little paranoid. But you are fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of complex corporate acquisitions." He actually reached out and patted my blanket as if calming a frightened animal. He explained that real estate development required massive capital liquidity, that keeping Ezekiel alive on machines was just delaying the inevitable, and that Vanguard was simply stepping in to manage a tragic situation efficiently. "You play around with spreadsheets and audit reports," he said smoothly, his eyes crinkling with fake sympathy. "But I manage high-stakes urban revitalization. I am breathing life back into a dilapidated neighborhood. You should be thanking me for protecting your family's assets before the city seizes that blighted property for unpaid taxes." He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a leather-bound checkbook and a solid gold fountain pen. "Look, I get it," he murmured, projecting an aura of manufactured understanding. "You are stressed about money. You have been working yourself to the bone for that accounting degree, and you have nothing to show for it but a mountain of debt. It makes people bitter. So I'm going to do you a massive favor." He scribbled quickly on the check, tore it out, and held it in front of my face. "Here is a personal check for $10,000. Go pay off those little student loans of yours. Buy yourself a reliable car. Take a vacation. Let the adults handle the heavy lifting today. Just sign the release, and you can walk away free and clear." Before I could even react to the sheer insult of his bribe, my own parents swooped in to defend him. Desmond crossed his arms, glaring at me with absolute disgust. For once in your life, Zuri, stop being so intentionally difficult, my father snapped. Preston is offering you a lifeline and you are acting like an ungrateful brat. You have always been exactly like this. You hide in your room, burying your nose in textbooks because you are completely incapable of making valuable connections in the real world. Patricia stepped up right beside him, her voice rising to that shrill, piercing pitch I had feared my entire childhood. It is jealousy, Desmond. It has always been jealousy, she spat, pointing an accusing finger at me. Ever since you were little, you could never stand to see Chloe happy. You resented her popularity, and now you resent that she married a highly successful, brilliant man, while you have absolutely nothing going for you. Preston is trying to elevate this family name. He is bringing us into circles you could not even dream of entering. And here you are trying to sabotage your sister's marriage and our financial future just to throw a petty tantrum. Chloe smirked from the corner, crossing her arms over her designer blouse. She is just mad because her little accounting hobby is not going to pay the ICU bills, Chloe sneered. Sign the papers, Zuri. Stop embarrassing us in front of my husband. I looked at the $10,000 check fluttering in Preston's hand. He was trying to buy my grandfather's life, my heritage, and my silence for the price of a used sedan. He genuinely believed that because I was a black woman laying vulnerable in a hospital bed, I would eagerly bow down to his mediocre financial leverage. He thought his proximity to wealth and whiteness made him untouchable. I slowly reached out. Preston's smug smile widened as he assumed I was taking the check. But my hand moved right past his offering. I grabbed the thick stack of legal documents resting on my blanket. I gripped the binding tightly, my knuckles turning white. With a sudden, explosive burst of adrenaline, I ripped the entire contract straight down the middle. The sound of tearing paper was deafening in the sterile, quiet hospital room. I threw the shredded halves directly into Preston's chest. They fluttered to the floor, landing right on his polished Italian leather shoes. The silence that followed was absolute. Preston's fake, placating smile vanished instantly. His face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. The charming corporate savior was gone, replaced by the ruthless predator I always knew he was. He leaned in so close I could feel the heat of his breath against my cheek. His eyes were cold and dead. "You just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic life," he whispered. I did not flinch. I did not shrink back into the pillows like the obedient, invisible middle child they had trained me to be. Instead, I looked directly into Preston's dead, shark-like eyes and smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a woman who had just caught a thief with his hands buried elbow-deep in the vault. Section 409A of the tax code, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy, suffocating silence of the room. Combined with a fraudulent transfer of fiduciary duties under severe medical duress. You really thought you could slip a life insurance waiver into a standard property release, and a forensic accountant would just sign it because you waved $10,000 in her face. Preston stepped back, his posture stiffening as the charming savior facade completely disintegrated. The color drained from Chloe's perfectly contoured cheeks. Life insurance, Desmond blustered, stepping forward and shoving his hands deep into the pockets of his expensive slacks. What on earth are you talking about, Zuri? This is about the commercial block. Preston is doing us a massive favor, taking that crumbling real estate off our hands before the city condemns it. I shifted my gaze to my father, the great Desmond Washington, a man who had spent his entire adult life curating an image of elite black excellence while secretly drowning in country club membership fees and terrible stock investments. He had always resented Ezekiel for refusing to bail him out, and now he was finally getting his revenge. He is playing you, Dad, I said, my tone flat and unforgiving. Preston does not just want the property. Ezekiel has a multi-million-dollar life insurance policy. The clause on page 47 transfers the beneficiary rights directly to Vanguard Developments. Preston is planning to pull Grandpa's life support the second the ink dries to fund his luxury condo project. He needs that cash injection to cover the demolition costs, and you are literally handing him the murder weapon. Patricia gasped loudly, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. But she did not look horrified at Preston. She looked absolutely horrified at me. "How dare you accuse your brother-in-law of such a monstrous thing?" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the sterile linoleum walls. "Preston has been keeping this family afloat for 2 years. He paid for your father's car. He paid for this Parisian vacation. You have always been so desperate for attention, so painfully jealous of Chloe, that you would rather invent wild corporate conspiracies than see your sister happy." Mom read the contract I demanded, pointing to the shredded pieces scattered across the floor. "Pick it up and read the fine print." "I will do no such thing," she snapped, smoothing the lapels of her cashmere coat. "You are clearly suffering from hypoxia. The doctors warned us you might experience severe cognitive decline after your collapse. You are completely delusional." Chloe scoffed, stepping closer to Preston and wrapping her arm possessively through his. "She is not delusional, Mom. She is just a bitter, lonely spinster. You have been auditing fraudulent corporate spreadsheets for so long you think everyone is a criminal. Preston is a visionary developer. He builds communities. He creates value. You just ruin things because you are miserable." I stared at my sister, feeling a profound wave of disgust. She was so desperate to maintain her status as the wealthy developer's wife that she was willing to turn a blind eye to the literal execution of our grandfather. Preston was using her proximity to the Washington family name to buy up Black-owned real estate for pennies on the dollar, and she was happily playing the role of his corporate mascot. "He is building a monument to his own greed over the ashes of our legacy," I shot back, gripping the bedsheets. "And he is using your marriage as a PR shield to get it done." Preston straightened his silk tie, the predatory mask slipping back into place. "Let her talk, Chloe," he said smoothly, his voice dripping with icy confidence. "Let her spin her little theories. It does not matter. The board of Vanguard Developments has already filed the competency petition for Ezekiel. The probate judge is a personal friend of the firm. By tomorrow morning, the state will declare the old man legally unfit. And since you are currently sitting in a cardiac intensive care ward, clearly suffering from severe mental distress, I will have my legal team petition to remove you as the secondary trustee." He stepped closer to the bed, his voice dropping to a conversational, chilling tone. "I tried to do this the easy way, Zuri. I tried to play the good guy. I tried to give you a nice little bonus to walk away quietly and pay off your debts. But if you want to play dirty, I will bury you. I will tie you up in civil court for the next decade. You will spend every single cent you have ever saved on legal fees fighting me, and I will still demolish that building." Desmond nodded in furious agreement, a cowardly gesture that disgusted me more than Preston's overt threats. "Listen to him, Zuri. You cannot fight Vanguard. You do not have the capital or the political connections. You are going to lose the property anyway. At least if you sign the new copies Preston's lawyers draft up, we can all walk away with a percentage." "You mean you can walk away with a percentage?" I corrected him, my voice shaking with rage. "You sold out your own father to maintain a country club lifestyle you cannot afford." "That is enough," Patricia yelled, stepping forward and slamming her hand against the metal bedrail. "I am your mother, and I am telling you to stop this foolishness right now. You will sign the new papers tomorrow morning when Preston returns, or you are officially cut out of this family. We will not pay a single medical bill for your recovery. We will not claim you." "You never claimed me anyway," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "I was always just the embarrassing backup child." Without breaking eye contact with my mother, I reached over with my uninjured arm and slammed my hand down on the red emergency call button taped to the bedrail. I pressed it 3 times in rapid, frantic succession. Preston's eyes narrowed. "What are you doing?" "Calling security," I declared loudly, "because I am currently being extorted and threatened by 3 unauthorized visitors while recovering from acute heart failure." A team of nurses and a burly hospital security guard immediately rushed through the open door, their expressions alarmed by the blaring alarm. I pointed a shaking finger directly at Preston. "These people are harassing me. They are trying to force me to sign financial documents against my will. Get them out of my room immediately." The head nurse, a fierce, no-nonsense woman who had been monitoring my unstable vitals all week, immediately stepped between my bed and Preston. "Visiting hours are over," she declared, her tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "My patient's blood pressure is spiking to dangerous levels. Everyone needs to leave this room right now, or I am calling the police." Preston held up his hands in a placating gesture, effortlessly slipping back into his charming, non-threatening persona. Of course, of course. We were just leaving." Family disagreements can get a little heated when emotions are running high. He turned toward the door, guiding Chloe by the waist. Desmond and Patricia followed closely behind, casting dark, resentful glares in my direction. But right before Preston crossed the threshold, he paused. He looked back over his shoulder, his gaze locking onto mine with absolute chilling certainty. "Get some rest, Zuri," Preston said, his voice loud enough for the protective nurses to hear. Then he mouthed the next words so only I could catch them. "The bulldozers arrive at dawn." The heavy door swung shut, leaving me completely alone with the frantic, irregular beeping of my heart monitor. Dawn. I looked up at the digital clock mounted on the wall. It was 6 in the evening. I had exactly 12 hours to break out of an intensive care unit, cross the entire city of Atlanta, bypass Vanguard's private security thugs, and unlock Ezekiel's hidden floor safe. I threw off the thin hospital blanket and swung my bare legs over the edge of the mattress. My lungs burned instantly, and the room spun dangerously as my feet hit the cold linoleum, but I gripped the antique brass key tightly in my fist. I was not going to let them erase our history. I watched his polished Italian leather shoes retreat, the heavy hospital door swinging shut behind his tailored back. The threat hung in the sterile air, toxic and heavy, but it did not paralyze me. It catalyzed me. Looking back now, sitting in the quiet, secure command center I eventually built for myself, I realized that specific moment was the fulcrum of my entire existence. Preston genuinely believed his proximity to wealth and whiteness made him invincible. He thought the corporate shield of Vanguard Developments was an impenetrable fortress, certainly safe from a black woman recovering in a cardiac intensive care ward. If he wanted a war, he chose the absolute wrong forensic accountant to antagonize. The second the door clicked shut, my tears completely evaporated. My heart monitor beeped with a steady, furious rhythm that matched the adrenaline flooding my veins. I buzzed the night nurse painting on a strained smile and claimed I needed to do some light remote work to distract myself from the pain. I begged her to retrieve my laptop from the hospital security locker. The moment the cold aluminum chassis touched my lap and my fingers hit the familiar keyboard, the physical agony in my chest faded into the background. I was no longer a helpless victim trapped in a hospital bed. I was an auditor on a hunt, and I had a scent. Vanguard Developments was a private equity real estate firm, which meant their internal financials were guarded with intense paranoia. But no corporate fortress is entirely airtight. I started with the basics, pulling public property records, LLC registrations, and municipal tax filings. Preston's name was buried beneath thick layers of corporate obfuscation. Vanguard was not just a single entity, it was a hydra. Every time I traced a property deed or a construction permit, it branched off into a dozen anonymous shell companies. There were Delaware holding companies nested inside Cayman Island offshore accounts specifically structured to obscure the true flow of capital. It was a classic ghost maze, a labyrinth designed to legally launder assets, shield the executives from personal liability, and confuse auditors. But I was not just any auditor. I knew exactly how men like Preston thought. They were arrogant, and arrogance breeds sloppy digital hygiene. I needed access to their internal ledgers, which meant bypassing their firewalls. I am an accountant by trade, not a hacker, but in the world of high-level forensic data recovery, the line between the two is remarkably thin. I remembered a careless mistake Preston had made at a family holiday dinner months ago, drunkenly boasting about his firm's newly integrated cloud accounting software while trying to impress my father. He had practically handed me the vendor name on a silver platter. Using a combination of brute force credential algorithms and socially engineered backdoors. I had learned during my corporate fraud investigation training. I began chipping away at the outer perimeter of Vanguard's digital network. It was highly illegal, a federal offense that could easily result in years behind bars, but I was way past caring about the law when the law was actively being weaponized to murder my grandfather. Hours bled into the dead of night. The hospital ward went completely silent, save for the rhythmic hum of my medical machinery and the frantic, relentless clicking of my keys. My eyes burned, tearing up from the harsh blue light of the screen, but I refused to stop. I downloaded thousands of pages of encrypted financial data, running them directly through my own customized analytical software to spot the anomalies. I sifted through massive spreadsheets, balance sheets, profit and loss statements, and quarterly investor dividend reports. Preston constantly projected the image of a billionaire titan, a master of the universe, who turned everything he touched into gold. But the raw mathematics told a completely different, desperate story. Vanguard Developments was hemorrhaging cash at an alarming rate. Their flagship luxury projects in Midtown Atlanta were bleeding capital due to severe supply chain delays, zoning disputes, and massive municipal fines. They simply did not have the liquid assets required to purchase Ezekiel's commercial block, let alone finance the demolition and the subsequent construction of a high-end condo complex. I paused, rubbing my aching temples, letting the glow of the screen illuminate the dark room. If Vanguard was essentially broke on paper, where was the money coming from? I dove deeper, tracing the specific capital allocation that had been approved for the Atlanta acquisition. The routing numbers attached to the impending purchase did not align with Vanguard's primary operating accounts or their corporate credit lines. I followed the digital breadcrumbs, matching the outgoing wire transfers to a completely separate, heavily restricted escrow account. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned closer to the screen, my pulse pounding so hard, the medical monitor beside me began to chime a warning. I silenced it immediately, my eyes locked on the ledger. The number stared back at me, stark cold and undeniable. Preston was not using corporate profits or secured bank loans to steal Ezekiel's property. He was using highly illegal cross-collateralized funds embezzled directly from his own investors. He was draining retirement portfolios, pension funds, and private equity trusts to cover his failing real estate acquisitions. He was running a high-stakes, incredibly fragile Ponzi scheme, gambling that the future condo sales from my grandfather's demolished legacy would eventually replenish the stolen capital before the Securities and Exchange Commission or his wealthy investors ever noticed the massive discrepancy. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. Preston had threatened to bankrupt me. He had threatened to take everything I ever tried to build. But he had fundamentally misunderstood the power dynamic. He thought he held all the cards because he had a forged signature and a fancy suit. He did not realize that I now held the digital key to his entire empire, and I was about to burn it to the ground. As the final encrypted files transferred to my secure external drive, a brief, intoxicating wave of triumph washed over me. I had the smoking gun. Preston's entire pristine corporate facade was built on a foundation of stolen money and shattered trust. I carefully unplugged the drive, slipping it into the inner pocket of my jacket, ready to pull the intravenous lines from my arm and walk out of that hospital. But my temporary high shattered the moment my phone screen illuminated with a cascading waterfall of social media notifications. I had not checked my personal accounts in days, but now my phone was vibrating so violently it nearly rattled right off the sterile bedside table. I swiped open the screen and saw my sister's face. Chloe had just posted a video, and it was already spreading like a digital wildfire. She was sitting in what looked like the back of a luxury town car, but she had expertly and completely stripped away her usual glamorous persona. Her designer sunglasses were gone. She wore no makeup, her eyes artfully red, rimmed, her hair pulled back into a messy bun that must have taken her stylist an hour to look perfectly unkempt. She was staring directly into the camera, tears spilling down her cheeks, in a masterful performance of manufactured heartbreak. Chloe choked out a sob, telling her hundreds of thousands of followers that our family was living an absolute nightmare. She claimed that our beloved grandfather was lying in a coma, desperately needing a highly specialized life-saving cardiovascular surgery that his insurance refused to cover. She painted Preston as the generous, benevolent son-in-law who had graciously offered his corporate firm's immense resources to pay for the entire procedure out of pocket. Then the tears intensified, and Chloe dropped the real poison. She told the world that I was holding our grandfather hostage. She claimed I was suffering from an unhinged, dangerous mental breakdown motivated by deep-seated jealousy and greed. She looked directly into the lens and sobbed that I was refusing to sign standard medical release forms because I wanted to extort the family for cash, that my bitter resentment over her successful marriage was literally going to cost Ezekiel his life. To ensure maximum damage, she tagged local Atlanta news outlets and prominent community leaders, ensuring the false narrative escaped our immediate circle and bled into the city's broader consciousness. The video had been live for less than an hour, but the fallout was instantaneous and catastrophic. The comment section was a cesspool of outrage, and my personal inbox was completely flooded. This was not just a public relations stunt. It was a targeted, synchronized smear campaign designed to destroy my credibility before I could ever expose Vanguard developments. My text messages began to ping relentlessly, a barrage of vitriol from the exact extended family members who had actively ignored my existence for years. Aunt Beatrice, a woman who had borrowed $2,000 from me 3 years ago and conveniently forgot my phone number when it was time to repay it, sent a blistering voice note. She called me a selfish, jealous pariah who had always envied Chloe's light and wanted to drag the whole family down into my misery. Uncle Marcus, who always parroted Desmond's toxic talking points, sent a massive block of text accusing me of being a disgrace to the Black community. He claimed I was single-handedly holding back generational wealth, actively destroying a prime real estate deal that could finally elevate our family name into the true upper echelon of society, all because I was a bitter spinster who could not secure a man of her own. Cousin Valerie, who only ever reached out when she needed free corporate tax preparation, texted me to say I was dead to her. They swallowed Chloe's lies without a single second of hesitation. They did not call to ask for my side of the story. They did not check to see if I was recovering from my own heart failure. They simply rallied behind the golden child and her wealthy white savior husband, eager to tear me down to protect their proximity to power and prestige. I sat there in the dim light of the hospital room, watching the hate roll across my screen, reading messages from blood relatives, calling me a monster and a thief. They were weaponizing our shared heritage against me, turning me into a public villain so Preston could quietly bulldoze our history without a single dissenting voice. I took a deep, shaky breath, fighting the tightness gripping my chest. I knew Preston was ruthless, but leveraging my own sister to incite a digital mob was a new level of psychological warfare. They wanted to isolate me completely. They wanted to make sure that even if I walked out of this hospital with undeniable proof of his financial crimes, absolutely no one would believe a word out of the mouth of a disgraced, hysterical woman. I moved to put the phone down to finally disconnect the medical monitors and make my escape, when a new notification dropped down from the top of the screen. It was not a social media alert or an angry text from a cousin. It was an email from my corporate accounting firm. The subject line read simply, "Urgent employment status." I opened the message, my eyes scanning the brief clinical paragraphs. It was directly from the senior managing partner. The email stated that the firm had been made aware of a deeply concerning viral video regarding my personal conduct and mental stability. They claimed that my actions, as depicted by my own family, represented a severe violation of the firm's core values and ethical standards. Citing the moral turpitude clause in my employment contract, they noted the highly sensitive nature of our financial work and the immense public backlash I was currently generating. The partners had convened an emergency meeting. Effective immediately, I was placed on indefinite unpaid administrative leave pending a full internal investigation. My corporate access was completely revoked. My security badge was deactivated. I was explicitly instructed not to contact any clients or enter the building under any circumstances. In the span of a single afternoon, my family had not just turned the world against me. They had completely stripped me of my livelihood, my professional reputation, and my sole source of income. I slowly lowered the phone to my lap. The screen went dark, reflecting my own pale face in the quiet hospital room. Preston had promised to bankrupt me, and he had just delivered the first devastating blow. I was entirely alone, publicly disgraced, and effectively fired. I had no money, no allies, and a massive target on my back. But as I touched the cold metal of Ezekiel's floor-safe key, hidden safely in my pocket, the sheer injustice of it all burned away my remaining fear. They wanted me destroyed, but they had just given me absolutely nothing left to lose. I carefully peeled the adhesive EKG sensors off my chest, wincing as the sticky tape pulled at my skin. I quickly navigated the digital menu on the monitor beside my bed, placing the machine on standby mode to prevent the alarm from triggering at the nurse's station. My hands were shaking, and a dull throbbing ache radiated through my chest with every shallow breath. But the adrenaline surging through my veins served as a powerful anesthetic. My family had stripped me of my job, my reputation, and my dignity, but they had drastically underestimated my absolute refusal to lose. I slipped out of my hospital bed, my bare feet hitting the cold linoleum floor. I grabbed a discarded doctor's coat, hanging over a chair in the hallway, pulling it tightly around my shoulders to cover my hospital gown. Keeping my head down, I moved through the dim, sterile corridors of the cardiac ward, like a ghost. The hospital at 3 a.m. was a quiet liminal space filled only with the rhythmic beeping of machines and the soft hum of the ventilation system. My grandfather's room was located at the far end of the intensive care unit. As I approached the heavy glass door, I expected to see the familiar face of his assigned night nurse. Instead, a stranger was standing over Ezekiel's bed. He was a tall, excessively tanned man, wearing a tailored suit that cost more than most nurses made in a month, with a white lab coat thrown carelessly over his shoulders. He did not smell like hospital sanitizer or iodine. He smelled of stale cigarette smoke, expensive scotch, and peppermint. He was holding a thick leather clipboard, casually flipping through Ezekiel's highly restricted medical chart while scribbling notes with a gold pen. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" I demanded, my voice slicing through the quiet room. The man jumped, nearly dropping his pen. He turned to face me, his eyes darting to my hospital gown peeking out from beneath the stolen coat. "You gave me a fright," he said, recovering his composure with a slick, practiced smile. "I am Dr. Vance. I am a private psychiatric consultant retained by the Washington family. I am just completing a routine secondary evaluation." I stepped further into the room, placing myself directly between him and my grandfather's life support machines. Ezekiel looked so frail, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator. "There is no secondary evaluation authorized for this patient," I said, my tone flat and dangerous. "I am the secondary medical proxy. No private specialists are allowed access to his chart without my explicit written consent." Dr. Vance's smile tightened into a condescending smirk. "Actually, young lady, I was hired by Desmond and Patricia Washington. As the patient's immediate next of kin, they have authorized a full competency review. Now, if you will excuse me, I need to finalize this affidavit." He reached for the chart again, but I was faster. I snatched the leather clipboard right out of his hands, stepping back out of his reach. "Give that back immediately," Vance snapped, the pleasantries vanishing entirely. "That is a confidential legal document. I am a forensic auditor." I fired back, my eyes rapidly scanning the paperwork. "I eat confidential legal documents for breakfast." My gaze locked onto the header of the document and my blood ran ice cold. It was not a hospital evaluation form. It was a formal affidavit of incompetence and incapacitation formatted specifically for the Fulton County Probate Court. I read the clinical notes Vance had scribbled in the margins, and my stomach violently churned. According to this sworn medical statement, Ezekiel Washington was suffering from advanced irreversible vascular dementia. Vance had documented completely fabricated incidents of severe cognitive decline, claiming my grandfather had been experiencing violent delusions, memory loss, and a total inability to manage his own daily affairs for over a year. "This is a complete fabrication," I whispered, staring at the fraudulent diagnoses. "My grandfather does not have dementia. I spoke to him 3 days ago about municipal tax codes and the fluctuating interest rates on commercial mortgages. His mind is sharper than yours." Vance crossed his arms, looking at me with dead, apathetic eyes. "My professional assessment concludes otherwise. The patient is entirely non-responsive and legally incapacitated." I looked at the dates stamped at the top of the evaluation, and the true horrifying scope of the conspiracy suddenly clicked into place. The dates on Vance's preliminary evaluations preceded Ezekiel's heart attack by a full month. Desmond and Patricia had not made a desperate, grief-stricken decision in the waiting room. They had been planning this absolute betrayal for weeks. They knew that as long as Ezekiel was legally competent, my status as the secondary trustee protected the commercial block. Preston could not buy the property, and Vanguard Developments could not demolish it. But if a doctor officially declared Ezekiel legally incompetent, the entire power dynamic instantly shifted. Under state probate law, a declaration of severe mental incapacitation would bypass my trustee status, entirely transferring a permanent, irrevocable power of attorney directly to his primary next of kin, Desmond. With Desmond holding the legal power of attorney, he could forcibly authorize the life support waiver, terminate Ezekiel's care, collect the life insurance payout, and sign the commercial deeds over to Preston's fraudulent shell companies, without my signature ever being required. They were executing a perfectly legal hostile takeover of a dying man's life. "I am calling the hospital administrator," I said, gripping the clipboard so tightly my knuckles ached. "I am having you arrested for trespassing and medical fraud." Vance let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Go right ahead. Call them. Tell them your parents hired a second opinion. See who they believe, the wealthy, concerned son trying to do what is best for his dying father, or the hysterical, disgruntled granddaughter who just got fired from her accounting firm for having a public mental breakdown." He casually reached over and pulled the clipboard out of my frozen hands. "You lost, little girl. Preston sends his regards." Vance turned and walked out of the room, leaving a trail of peppermint and stale smoke in his wake. I stood there trembling with a mixture of raw grief and blinding fury, my eyes fixed on the final page of the document I had just read. The emergency probate hearing to finalize the competency evaluation and grant Desmond full power of attorney was stamped by a judge. It was scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. I had exactly 24 hours before my father legally signed away his own father's life. I had no job, no corporate backing, no money to hire a litigator, and a family that had actively engineered a viral smear campaign to destroy my credibility in front of the entire city. Preston had built an impenetrable wall of money and influence around his crimes, ensuring I had absolutely no legal resources to fight back. I looked down at my grandfather, listening to the hissing of the ventilator keeping him alive. I did not have a lawyer, and I did not have a dime to my name, but I had the truth, and I had 24 hours to make them choke on it. I ripped the final cardiac lead from my chest, suppressing a sharp gasp as the adhesive tore at my skin. I threw the heavy winter coat over my hospital gown, shoved my feet into the cheap foam slippers they had provided upon admission, and walked straight out of the intensive care unit. A bewildered night nurse shouted after me, threatening to call security and waving an against medical advice form, but I did not stop. I pushed through the double doors, rode the elevator down to the lobby, and walked out into the freezing Atlanta night. The air hit my lungs like shattered glass, a harsh reminder of my failing heart, but the rage pumping through my system kept me upright. I flagged down a half-asleep taxi driver loitering near the emergency room entrance and gave him the address of Ezekiel's commercial block in the historic Sweet Auburn district. The ride across the city was a blur of neon lights and shadows. I kept my hand wrapped tightly around the brass key in my pocket. The sun was just beginning to bleed over the horizon when the taxi pulled up to the corner of Auburn Avenue. I handed the driver the last bit of emergency cash I kept in my phone case and stepped out onto the pavement. The sight that greeted me made my blood boil. It was barely dawn, but the block was already swarming with Vanguard development operatives. Half a dozen men in tactical black jackets were systematically moving from door to door along the row of legacy black-owned businesses. They were slapping aggressive neon green notices onto the storefront glass. These were not standard legal postings, they were intimidation tactics. I watched as Miss Mabel, a woman who had run the neighborhood bakery for 40 years, stood on the sidewalk clutching her apron, her face pale with terror. 2 doors down, Mr. Henderson was arguing with a Vanguard thug who was actively taping a notice over the vintage lettering of his barbershop window. The entire block, a historic cornerstone of generational wealth and community resilience, was being treated like a conquered territory. And standing in the center of it all, sipping a coffee from an artisanal paper cup, was Preston. He was dressed in a pristine camel hair overcoat, surveying the panic he had orchestrated with a look of profound satisfaction. He was acting like a king, admiring his new kingdom. When he spotted me limping down the sidewalk in my oversized coat and hospital slippers, his smug smile widened into a predatory grin. "Well, look who decided to join the waking world," Preston called out, his voice carrying over the morning traffic. "I have to admit, Zuri, I am impressed. I thought the hospital would have sedated you by now, or at least put you in a padded room after that little outburst last night." I ignored the throbbing pain in my chest and walked directly up to him. "You are terrorizing these people illegally, Preston. You do not have the deed, and Desmond does not have the power of attorney yet. These eviction notices are completely fraudulent." Preston took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. He leaned in his cologne, masking the smell of the diesel exhaust from the idling security trucks. "They are preemptive notices!" Zuri, he corrected, his tone dripping with condescension. "Just giving the tenants a friendly heads up that their leases are being terminated. The probate hearing is at 9 o'clock. Desmond will have the power of attorney by 9:15. He signs the waiver and the deed over to Vanguard by 10. Preston gestured broadly toward the historic brick facades. "Enjoy the architecture while it lasts. The wrecking balls are already parked in a staging lot 2 miles from here. Demolition starts on Friday at exactly 6 in the morning. We are going to wipe this entire block off the map and pour the foundation for the Vanguard luxury lofts before the dust even settles. You cannot tear down a historical district without a municipal review." I shot back, my voice steady, despite the trembling in my knees. Preston laughed, a sharp barking sound that made Miss Mabel flinch. "Oh, sweet, naive Zuri. I own the municipal review board. I own the zoning commissioner. I own your father, and by proxy, I own your grandfather. You have absolutely nothing. No job, no money, and no credibility. You are a fired accountant standing on a sidewalk in hospital slippers. Go home." He waved his hand dismissively at his security detail. "Let the crazy lady wander around for a bit. Let her say goodbye to the rubble. Just make sure she stays out of the way of the real adults." Preston turned his back on me, returning to his phone. I did not engage. I did not scream. I saved my energy and walked right past him, heading straight for the heavy oak door at the far end of the block. It was Ezekiel's private office, the undisputed nerve center of his real estate empire. A Vanguard guard stepped forward to block my path, but I simply held up the brass key. He glanced back at Preston, who gave a careless nod, and the guard stepped aside. I unlocked the heavy door and slipped inside, locking the deadbolt firmly behind me. The office smelled of old paper lemon oil and the faint, comforting aroma of my grandfather's pipe tobacco. The space was exactly as he had left it before the heart attack. Large mahogany desk, leather wingback chairs, and walls lined with decades of community awards and architectural blueprints. I did not waste a single second. I moved directly to the large Persian rug dominating the center of the room. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the sharp spike of pain in my ribs, and rolled the heavy carpet back. Beneath it lay the original hardwood floor, worn smooth by time. I counted 3 boards from the left side of the desk, found the subtle notch hidden in the wood grain, and pressed down. With a soft click, a square section of the floorboards popped up, revealing a heavy iron safe embedded directly into the foundation. It was an old-school rotary dial model, the kind you could not crack with a digital algorithm. But it had a secondary manual override slot. I pulled the brass key from my pocket. My hands were shaking so violently I nearly dropped it. I slid the heavy metal key into the slot and turned it hard to the right. The internal tumblers groaned a heavy mechanical sound before the heavy iron door finally swung open. I did not know what I expected to find. Stacks of emergency cash, classified ledgers, perhaps a letter outlining Desmond's financial betrayals, but the safe was almost entirely empty, save for a single thick manila envelope resting at the bottom. I reached down and pulled it out. The envelope was heavy, sealed with thick red wax. I broke the seal and slid the contents out onto the floorboards. It was a stack of legal documents printed on thick watermarked paper. I flattened the pages out my eyes, desperately scanning the dense legal jargon. It was a warranty deed, a complete unencumbered transfer of property. I looked at the property description. It listed every single address on the commercial block. Every storefront, every parcel of land, every square inch of the property Vanguard was currently trying to steal. Then I looked at the signatures. At the bottom of the page, signed in Ezekiel's unmistakable bold handwriting, was a complete transfer of the property title, and sitting right beside it was the bright blue stamp of a licensed state notary. I read the grantee name, and all the air completely vanished from my lungs. Ezekiel had not transferred the property into a trust. He had not left it to my father. He had not left it to Chloe. The deed transferred absolute, unencumbered ownership of the entire commercial block directly to Zuri, Washington. I checked the date stamped next to the notary seal. It was dated exactly 12 months ago. A wild, breathless laugh escaped my throat, echoing in the dusty office. Preston was outside right now, gloating about a probate hearing. Desmond was preparing to declare his father incompetent so he could steal the property. They had spent months building an intricate, fraudulent scheme to seize assets from a dying man. But you cannot seize a property from a man who no longer owns it. Ezekiel had known. He had seen the betrayal coming from his own son long before the heart attack, and he had quietly, legally shielded the entire empire by giving it to the only person he actually trusted. Preston's fake eviction notices, his impending wrecking balls, his fabricated power of attorney. They were all completely worthless. I owned the block. I owned the land standing beneath Preston's polished Italian shoes. And the bulldozer he promised for Friday morning was going to hit a titanium wall. I carefully folded the heavy watermarked paper and slid it deep into the inner pocket of my stolen doctor's coat. The sheer magnitude of what Ezekiel had done settled over me like a protective armor. He had not just given me a piece of real estate, he had handed me a loaded weapon. He had known his own son was entirely compromised by greed, and he had trusted me, the forgotten middle child, to serve as the ultimate fail-safe. I did not linger in the office. I locked the floor safe, rolled the Persian rug back into its precise original position, and slipped out the back exit into the alleyway. I could still hear Preston's arrogant laughter echoing from the main street, completely oblivious to the fact that he was trespassing on my private property. I walked 3 blocks to a 24-hour diner, ordered a black coffee, and waited for the city municipal building to open. Every time the diner door chimed, my pulse spiked, but I forced myself to remain perfectly still. At 8:30 in the morning, I paid my bill and walked directly to the county registrar's office. The clerk behind the thick glass partition looked at me with mild concern. I was still wearing hospital foam slippers and a coat over a patient gown, but I did not care. I slapped the original notarized warranty deed onto the marble counter. I paid the expedited filing fees using the very last of my emergency cash reserves. I stood there unmoving, watching the clerk scan the barcode and stamp the official county seal onto the documentation. The transfer was officially recorded in the municipal database. The commercial block belonged to Zuri, Washington. By legally recording the deed, I had triggered an automatic hard stop on any pending municipal actions regarding those parcels. Preston's demolition permits, which he had undoubtedly filed under Vanguard Developments using fraudulent authorizations, were instantly voided. The city could not approve a demolition without the verified signature of the primary property owner, and I was never going to sign. With the property secured, I needed to solidify the second phase of my counteroffensive. I left the registrar's office and navigated to a public library 2 towns over, a place where no one from Vanguard's security detail would ever think to look for me. I found a quiet, isolated cubicle in the back corner, sat down, and pulled my laptop from my bag. I plugged in the encrypted flash drive I had managed to smuggle out of my corporate office before they revoked my access. For the next 4 hours, I did exactly what I was trained to do. I followed the money. The financial spreadsheets Preston had tried to bury were a masterpiece of white-collar crime. But he had made the fatal mistake of underestimating my forensic auditing skills. I meticulously mapped out the complex web of shell companies Vanguard Developments was using to funnel money. Preston was not just manipulating local real estate. He was actively embezzling millions of dollars from his own primary investors to fund these hostile, off-the-books takeovers in legacy Black neighborhoods. I traced the wire transfers from Vanguard's main corporate accounts into 3 offshore dummy corporations. From there, the money was washed and returned to domestic accounts, disguised as anonymous capital investments. Preston was bleeding his own partners dry, artificially inflating the demolition costs and pocketing the massive difference. He was using those stolen funds to maintain Chloe's extravagant lifestyle, pay off Desmond's country club debts, and bribe private physicians like Dr. Vance to fabricate medical incompetence reports. It was a breathtakingly arrogant racketeering operation. If I handed this compiled data over to the Securities and Exchange Commission, Preston would not just lose his firm. He would face decades in federal prison. I organized the offshore account numbers, the fraudulent wire transfer receipts, and the internal emails detailing the fake eviction notices into a single undeniable dossier. I created 3 separate encrypted backups, sending one file to a secure cloud server and hiding the other 2 on secondary drives. I was finally holding all the cards. I had the deed. I had the proof of the embezzlement. I had the entire fraudulent scheme trapped in a digital box. I closed my laptop, a profound sense of vindication washing over my exhausted body. I was ready to walk into that hospital, bypass the security, and tear Preston's empire down to the studs. Then my phone buzzed violently against the wooden library desk. I glanced at the screen. It was a text message from my mother, Patricia. I opened the notification expecting another barrage of insults or a demand that I return to the cardiac ward to face my punishment. Instead, the words glowing on the screen made the blood freeze in my veins. "We got the POA. The property is ours. If you try to interfere, Preston's lawyers will ensure you go to federal prison for corporate espionage." I stared at the glowing text, the air hitching in my tight chest. They knew I had the files. Preston had realized I copied the encrypted ledgers before my termination went into effect. Instead of backing down, he was escalating. He was using his massive legal team to preemptively frame me for corporate espionage, turning my forensic investigation into a federal crime. He was threatening to lock me in a cage to silence me, and my own mother was delivering the threat. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought Desmond possessing a fraudulent power of attorney gave them absolute control over Ezekiel's assets. They had no idea I had just filed the original deed at the county registrar. They were currently celebrating a victory over a property they did not even own. I gripped the edge of the library table, a cold, dangerous calm replacing my initial shock. They wanted to threaten me with federal prison, but they were the ones actively committing fraud on a dying man. I picked up my phone and prepared to make the single most important phone call of my life. I dialed my mother's number. She answered on the first ring, her breathing sharp and anticipatory, waiting for the sound of my surrender. "I got your text," I said, keeping my voice utterly devoid of emotion. "You want the files? Where do we meet?" Patricia did not hesitate. She told me to come to the family estate immediately. She instructed me to use the side entrance so the neighbors would not see my disheveled state, then abruptly disconnected the line. The drive to my parents' sprawling suburban mansion felt like a funeral procession, though I was the only one mourning. I parked my beat-up sedan at the edge of their manicured circular driveway, painfully aware of the contrast between my reality and their meticulously curated illusion. I was still wearing the stolen hospital coat over my patient gown, my hair uncombed, my body running entirely on adrenaline and sheer spite. I unlocked the side door and stepped into the foyer. The sound of clinking crystal and bright manufactured laughter echoed from the formal dining room. I followed the noise, stepping directly into the lion's den. Desmond, Patricia, and Chloe were gathered around the massive mahogany dining table. A bottle of vintage champagne sat chilling in a silver bucket, and half-empty flutes rested in front of each of them. They were actively celebrating. They were toasting to the successful execution of their own father, reveling in the fraudulent power of attorney Desmond had secured just hours ago. When I crossed the threshold, the laughter died instantly. They looked at me with varying degrees of disgust and triumphant pity. "Look at you," Chloe sneered, swirling the golden liquid in her glass. "You look like a complete lunatic, Zuri, wandering out of the cardiac ward to hack into Preston's firm. Did you really think you could outsmart a corporate security system? His IT department flagged your unauthorized access the second you downloaded those ledgers." Desmond stood up, adjusting his custom-tailored suit jacket. He did not look like a man whose father was lying on life support. He looked like a man who had just won the lottery. "We are going to make this very simple, Zuri," my father said, his voice dropping into the authoritative tone he reserved for unruly subordinates. "Preston has the digital footprint. He has the IP address you used at the public library. He can prove you committed corporate espionage, data theft, and federal wire fraud. His legal team is ready to hand the entire packet over to the FBI. You are looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary." Patricia stepped forward, her perfectly manicured hands resting on the edge of the table. "We do not want to see our own daughter go to prison," she lied smoothly, her eyes completely devoid of maternal warmth. "It would be a horrific stain on the family's reputation. Preston is willing to show mercy, but you have to surrender the forensic files immediately and sign a strict non-disclosure agreement." Desmond reached under the table and hoisted a heavy silver aluminum briefcase onto the polished mahogany surface. He popped the latches. The lid sprang open, revealing neat banded stacks of $100 bills. $50,000, Desmond stated, pushing the briefcase across the table toward me. "It is entirely untraceable. Cash. Consider it a severance package. You take this money, you hand over the master flash drive containing the stolen data, and you walk away. You drop the ridiculous allegations, you stay away from the commercial block, and you let Vanguard Developments do its job. If you refuse, Preston makes the phone call to the federal authorities right now." I stared at the stacks of cash. $50,000. It was a laughable, insulting fraction of the millions Preston was currently embezzling from his own investors. They truly believed I was a desperate, broke, easily intimidated spinster who would crumble at the first mention of federal charges. They had absolutely no idea that I had already filed the original warranty deed transferring the commercial block to my name. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that their power of attorney was completely useless regarding that property. But if I told them the truth right now, Preston would simply pivot his strategy. He would use his massive wealth to tie me up in endless civil litigation, bleeding me dry until I was forced to sell the land just to pay my legal fees. I needed to destroy his entire empire in one swift, highly public execution. I needed the maximum audience possible. Preston's annual Vanguard Developments charity gala was scheduled for this weekend. The entire city elite would be there. City council members, major investors, the press, and the zoning board. It was the perfect stage. But to get there, I had to make them believe they had won. I had to give them the exact performance they expected. I let my shoulders slump forward, dropping the rigid posture I had maintained since walking into the room. I forced my breathing to hitch, channeling the very real physical exhaustion and heartbreak I felt over Ezekiel's condition. I squeezed my eyes shut, pushing out a hot, desperate tear that spilled down my cheek. My hands began to tremble and I let out a jagged, broken sob. "I have nothing," I cried, letting my voice crack and waver. "You took my job. You ruined my reputation. I do not have a lawyer. I do not have the money to fight Preston in federal court. I covered my face with my hands, crying harder, leaning heavily against the doorframe, as if my legs could no longer support my weight. I just wanted Grandpa to be safe. But I cannot go to prison. I cannot do it. Patricia sighed, a sound of profound relief masked as pity. We know, Zuri. We are giving you a way out. Take the money. I wiped my eyes with the sleeve of the hospital coat, sniffing loudly as I stepped forward and placed my hands on the briefcase. The files are heavily encrypted on a master drive hidden in a secure off-site locker. I lied, my voice shaking with perfectly manufactured defeat. I cannot access them until the weekend. I will bring the drive directly to Preston at the Vanguard Gala on Saturday. I will hand it to him personally so he knows I did not keep any copies. Just promise me he will not call the FBI. Desmond and Patricia exchanged a victorious look. As long as you deliver the drive to the gala and cause no scenes. Preston will drop the charges, Desmond assured me, snapping the briefcase shut and pushing it into my chest. I gripped the handle of the briefcase, keeping my head bowed in total submission as I backed away toward the door. Chloe took a sip of her champagne, her eyes gleaming with absolute malicious triumph. I knew you would eventually learn your place. The heavy oak door of my parents' mansion clicked shut behind me, instantly severing the sound of their triumphant celebratory laughter. The cool night air hit my face, and the manufactured, pathetic tears clinging to my cheeks evaporated into the darkness. I did not stumble. I did not sob. My spine straightened, snapping back into perfect rigid alignment as I walked across the manicured circular driveway toward my beat-up sedan. The silver aluminum briefcase swung heavily from my right hand. Chloe thought I had finally learned my place. She was absolutely right. My place was at the head of the boardroom, systematically preparing to dismantle her entire life. I unlocked my car, tossed the $50,000 onto the passenger seat, and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. A genuine predatory smile finally broke across my exhausted face. My family had just made the single most fatal miscalculation of their miserable lives. They had assumed my silence could be bought, but instead they had literally just handed me the upfront capital required to fund their own execution. I did not drive back to my apartment. I pulled out into the sparse, late-night traffic and headed straight for the financial district of downtown Atlanta. During my frantic hours at the public library, I had not just compiled Preston's fraudulent corporate ledgers. I had researched the exact weapon I needed to deliver them. Her name was Victoria Sterling. She was a senior partner at the most ruthless, aggressive corporate litigation firm in the state. She was a legal shark who specialized in destroying white-collar criminals and tearing apart complex embezzlement schemes. She did not take cases for justice or moral superiority. She took them for the kill, and she required a massive, prohibitive retainer just to walk through her door. It was a retainer I could not have dreamed of affording until my father generously shoved a briefcase full of untraceable hush money into my chest. I parked in the underground garage of the towering glass skyscraper and took the private elevator up to the penthouse suite. It was well past normal business hours, but Victoria had agreed to an emergency consultation after I mentioned Vanguard developments and a multi-million-dollar racketeering scheme on her secure voicemail. I walked into the sleek, modern conference room. Victoria was sitting at the head of a long, frosted glass table, sipping a black espresso. She looked me up and down, taking in the wrinkled, oversized doctor's coat I was still wearing over my hospital gown. Before she could dismiss me as a delusional vagrant, I hoisted the silver briefcase onto the table and popped the heavy metal latches. I turned it around, revealing the neat banded stacks of $100 bills. That is $50,000 in cash, I stated, my voice echoing sharply in the quiet room. It is my retainer. I have a legally filed, officially notarized warranty deed proving I am the sole owner of the historic Auburn Avenue commercial block. I also have the encrypted forensic ledgers proving Preston Vanguard is actively embezzling millions of dollars from his primary investors to illegally demolish it. I need you to help me lock him in a federal penitentiary. Victoria's sharp eyes shifted from the stacks of money to my face. She slowly closed the briefcase, pulled a sleek silver laptop toward her, and gave me a sharp, dangerous nod. Show me exactly what you have. For the next 4 hours, we sat side by side in the quiet penthouse, tearing into the digital entrails of Preston's empire. I plugged in the encrypted flash drive, pulling up the complex web of offshore shell companies and fraudulent wire transfers I had uncovered. I showed her how Preston was artificially inflating the demolition estimates for his luxury developments, siphoning the excess capital, and washing it through dummy corporations to fund his personal lifestyle. Victoria's fingers flew across her keyboard rapidly, cross-referencing my data with public municipal filings and corporate registry databases. She was brilliant, cold, and meticulously thorough. Every time I revealed another layer of Preston's fraud, her smile grew wider. "He is incredibly arrogant," she noted, tracing a line of illicit funds right back to a domestic account registered under Vanguard's primary holding company. He left a digital trail wide enough to drive a freight train through. He thought nobody would ever bother to audit these specific neighborhood development projects because the city historically ignores the zoning laws in lower-income districts. He assumed he was untouchable. We had everything we needed to destroy him. The Securities and Exchange Commission would devour his firm alive. But Victoria was not satisfied. She picked up her desk phone and called her senior investigative paralegal, instructing him to pull the deep financial records on Preston's personal assets. "If we are going to bury a man with this much political influence," she said, her eyes locked on the glowing monitor, "we need to know exactly how over-leveraged he really is. We need to find his absolute breaking point." 30 minutes later, an encrypted file dropped into Victoria's inbox. She opened the heavy PDF, her eyes scanning the dense legal text. Suddenly, she stopped. She let out a low, disbelieving whistle and turned the laptop screen toward me. "You need to see this, Zuri." I leaned in, reading the fine print of a massive predatory mezzanine loan. Preston had not just embezzled investor money to stage this illegal demolition, he had run out of liquid capital 3 weeks ago. The municipal bribes, the payout to Desmond, the retainer for Dr. Vance to fabricate the medical records, and the private security thugs currently occupying the block. It all cost massive amounts of upfront cash that he could not safely pull from the offshore accounts without triggering an automatic federal audit. To keep the scheme afloat and cover the immediate bribes he had quietly collateralized his personal assets. He had secretly taken out a second high-yield mortgage on the $5 million Buckhead mansion he shared with Chloe. He had literally leveraged their entire marital home against the immediate successful demolition of Ezekiel's property. I stared at the document, the sheer staggering magnitude of his arrogance washing over me. "If the demolition permit fails to execute by Friday morning," Victoria explained, tapping the screen with her manicured fingernail, "he defaults on the primary condition of this short-term loan. The creditors will seize the mansion immediately. The foreclosure is automatic, brutal, and completely non-negotiable." I looked up from the screen, staring out the penthouse window at the glittering city skyline. Chloe had stood in my parents' dining room just hours ago, sipping vintage champagne and mocking me for being a bitter, lonely failure. She thought her proximity to a wealthy man made her infinitely superior. She had absolutely no idea that her husband had essentially bet her entire luxurious life on a rigged game of cards, and I was holding the winning deck. When the truth came out at the Vanguard Gala this weekend, Preston would not just be facing a mountain of federal racketeering indictments. He and my sister were going to be completely, undeniably homeless. Saturday arrived with the heavy, humid heat typical of an Atlanta evening. But inside my suite at the St. Regis, the air conditioning hummed with icy precision. I had used a fraction of Desmond's untraceable $50,000 bribe to book the room service and prepare for the night in absolute undisturbed peace. Tonight was the Vanguard Visionary Gala. It was the premier corporate social event of the season, a lavish champagne-soaked spectacle hosted at the historic Biltmore Hotel. Preston had invited the wealthiest, predominantly white developers, politicians, and private equity investors in the state. He was planning to stand on a mahogany stage, raise a crystal flute, and formally announce his acquisition of the Sweet Auburn commercial block. He was going to frame the destruction of our grandfather's legacy as a brilliant, forward-thinking urban revitalization project. He was going to throw $1 million party using money he had explicitly stolen from the very investors applauding him in the audience. The sheer staggering audacity of the man was almost impressive. I was sitting at the marble vanity applying a sharp wing of black eyeliner when my phone vibrated violently against the glass countertop. The screen flashed with an incoming video call. It was Chloe. I took a slow, steadying breath, carefully adjusting my features back into the meek, defeated mask of the broken sister they all expected me to be. I tapped the green accept button. Chloe filled the screen. She was standing in the cavernous white marble master bathroom of her Buckhead mansion, surrounded by professional ring lights and an army of scattered cosmetics. Her hair was swept up into an intricate, elegant chignon, and she was wearing a strapless gown dripping in hand-sewn crystals. But what caught my eye was the blinding diamond tennis necklace resting against her collarbone. She was absent-mindedly rubbing the jewels with her thumb, a gesture of pure, unadulterated arrogance. "Zuri, please tell me you are actually ready?" Chloe sighed, not bothering with a greeting. She leaned closer to her phone camera, inspecting her perfect lip gloss. "And please tell me you actually have the briefcase. Preston is already on edge tonight, and I do not have the energy to deal with one of your dramatic, moralistic meltdowns." "I have the master drive," I said, keeping my voice low and submissive. "I kept it safe, just like I promised Desmond. I am bringing it tonight." Chloe let out a sharp breath of relief, dropping her hand from the diamond necklace. "Good. Because tonight is the most important night of Preston's career. He is finally going to elevate the Washington family name. Do you have any idea who is on the guest list? The governor? The zoning commissioner? The entire board of Vanguard's primary equity partners? These are the people who actually own Atlanta Zuri. They are the people who matter. Preston is proving that we belong in this tier of society. He is saving Dad from bankruptcy, and he is taking that crumbling, embarrassing real estate off Grandpa's hands before it drags us all down." I stared at her through the screen. She was so entirely consumed by her own vanity, so desperate for the validation of Preston's elite social circle, that she had completely blinded herself to reality. I looked at the diamonds around her neck. I knew with absolute forensic certainty that those stones had been purchased with embezzled corporate funds. I looked at the imported Italian marble walls behind her. I knew that the predatory mezzanine loan Preston had secretly signed meant the bank was going to seize this entire property the second the Auburn Avenue demolition failed. Chloe was bragging about a kingdom that was already burning to the ground. "I am just glad it will all be over," I muttered, playing my part perfectly. "I just want to drop off the files and go home." "About that?" Chloe said, her tone suddenly shifting into something sharp and condescending. "The Biltmore is going to be packed with high-profile press and security. I really do not want you wandering through the main ballroom looking like a distressed charity case. It would just invite unwanted questions, and we have an aesthetic to maintain tonight." I remained silent, letting her dig her own grave. "When you arrive, go around to the back alley on 5th Street, Chloe instructed, waving her hand dismissively. "Go through the loading dock and take the service elevator up to the mezzanine level. My personal assistant will meet you by the catering kitchen. You hand her the drive, you take your little briefcase of cash, and you exit the same way you came in. Do not mingle. Do not try to talk to Preston. Just use the service elevator so you do not embarrass us. You understand, right?" I stared directly into my sister's eyes. I understood perfectly. She wanted me hidden away with the garbage out of sight, entirely erased from the glittering narrative she was building over the ashes of our grandfather's life. "I understand, Chloe," I said softly. "I will see you tonight." I ended the call and set the phone face down on the vanity. The meek, defeated posture instantly vanished from my shoulders. I stood up, rolled my neck, and walked across the plush hotel carpet toward the closet. I unzipped the heavy canvas garment bag hanging from the top rack. I had not used the hush money to hire Victoria Sterling. I had used it to fund a war. I slipped the garment off the hanger. It was a stunning floor-length silk gown in a shade of deep, venomous crimson. It was tailored to absolute weaponized perfection, clinging to my curves before cascading into a sharp, dramatic slit. It did not look like the dress of a defeated corporate auditor. It looked like the dress of an apex predator. I stepped into the gown and pulled the zipper up the back, feeling the heavy silk settle against my skin like armor. I stepped into a pair of towering black patent leather stilettos that made me an inch taller than Preston. I fastened a pair of minimalist razor-sharp gold earrings, completely ignoring the elaborate, ostentatious jewelry my mother had always tried to force on me. My phone chimed with a secure text message. It was from Victoria Sterling. The SEC contacts are in the room. The Biltmore audiovisual servers are completely hijacked and slaved to your device. The trap is set. Bring the match. I picked up the sleek, encrypted titanium flash drive from the nightstand. It contained the real unredacted corporate dossiers, the offshore routing numbers, the fraudulent eviction notices, and the undeniable proof of Preston's predatory loans. I dropped the small metal drive into my black evening clutch and snapped it shut with a definitive, echoing click. I walked back to the full-length mirror and stared at my reflection. The invisible, forgotten middle child was dead. The obedient daughter who shrank away from conflict had been buried the moment they threatened to pull my grandfather's life support for a profit margin. I smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from the crimson silk and offered my reflection a cold, unforgiving smile. "Let us go burn an empire," I whispered. The Biltmore Hotel was a towering monument to old Southern money, its grand Georgian architecture illuminated by harsh, sweeping spotlights that cut through the humid Atlanta night. I instructed my hired driver to pull the black town car directly up to the main valet stand, completely ignoring the discreet subterranean service alley Chloe had so thoughtfully mapped out for me. The valet, a young man in a crisp uniform, opened my door. I stepped out onto the plush red carpet, the crimson silk of my gown instantly catching the flash of local society photographers lingering near the entrance. I did not shrink away from the lenses. I did not bow my head. I kept my chin elevated, my posture flawless, and walked straight through the gilded front doors like I owned the building. The Vanguard Visionary Gala was exactly the kind of sterile high-dollar masquerade Preston excelled at orchestrating. The grand ballroom was draped in muted golds and stark whites echoing with the soft clink of crystal champagne flutes and the low predatory hum of practiced corporate networking. The room was packed to capacity with Vanguard's primary demographic wealthy, predominantly white private equity investors, municipal zoning commissioners, and local politicians who specialized in looking the other way for the right price. Massive digital banners hung from the vaulted ceilings, projecting glossy three-dimensional renderings of the proposed Vanguard luxury lofts. The images displayed sleek, soulless glass monoliths towering over sanitized, unrecognizable streets. There was no trace of the historic brick facades, the legacy barbershops, or the generational bakeries that currently occupied the Sweet Auburn district. It was a masterclass in corporate gaslighting. These people were drinking $1,000 champagne to celebrate the planned erasure of a historic black neighborhood, wrapping their greed in the polite, palatable language of urban philanthropy. I moved through the crowd, my crimson dress parting the sea of boring black tuxedos and muted designer gowns. I watched groups of investors pause their conversations to stare their eyes tracking the woman who clearly did not fit their established aesthetic. I did not stop to mingle. I did not accept a drink from the passing waiters. My eyes were locked on the far side of the ballroom. Preston was holding court near the base of the main stage, flanked by a local news crew and a cluster of fawning board members. He wore a bespoke tuxedo that fit him with razor-sharp precision, projecting the image of a benevolent savior bestowing his brilliance upon a desperate city. Chloe stood dutifully at his side, her massive diamond tennis necklace catching the harsh glare of the camera lights. She was smiling vacantly, nodding at exactly the right intervals, playing the perfect quiet corporate accessory. I drifted closer, stopping just outside the perimeter of the heavy lighting equipment, listening as Preston answered a reporter's eager question about the upcoming Sweet Auburn acquisition. "This project is not just about real estate," Preston said smoothly, staring directly into the camera lens with his practiced shark-like earnestness. "It is about revitalizing urban blight. Sweet Auburn has a rich history, certainly, but we cannot let nostalgia stand in the way of necessary progress. That commercial block has become an eyesore, an economic dead zone that is actively hurting the city. Vanguard Developments is stepping in to clean up the decay. We are going to elevate the demographics, stimulate the local economy, and bring true modernized value back to this community. Urban Blight, cleaning up the decay, elevating the demographic. The coded, racist dog whistles were so loud, they were practically deafening. He was standing on a stage funded by embezzled money, publicly degrading my grandfather's life's work. He was intentionally framing Ezekiel's thriving empire as a dirty, broken thing that only Preston Vanguard had the capital and the vision to fix. My fingers tightened around my black evening clutch. The encrypted titanium drive resting inside felt incredibly heavy against my palm. He was spinning a flawless public relations narrative, completely unaware that the ground beneath his feet was already rigged with explosives. I took a deliberate step toward the stage, ready to close the distance. Before my heel could hit the marble floor, a hand clamped down on my bare bicep with the force of a steel vice. I turned my head. My mother Patricia was glaring at me, her face pale and taut beneath her heavy, flawless makeup. She was wearing a silver sequined gown that looked stiff and uncomfortable, and the sheer panic radiating from her eyes was palpable. She yanked me backward with surprising strength, pulling me forcefully into a shadowed alcove near the ballroom exit doors, away from the glittering crowd. "What do you think you are doing?" Patricia hissed, her voice vibrating with barely contained rage. Her fingernails dug painfully into my arm. "Chloe specifically told you to use the service elevator. You were supposed to wait in the catering hallway until her assistant found you. Why are you dressed like this? You are drawing attention to yourself." I looked down at her hand, gripping my arm, then back up to her terrified, furious face. I did not flinch. "I am a guest, Mom," I said, my voice dangerously calm and entirely steady. "I decided to use the front door." "You are not a guest." Patricia spat, glancing nervously over her shoulder to see if any of the major investors were watching us. "You are a liability." Preston is about to give his keynote address. The governor is sitting at table 4. Desmond is already sweating through his suit, hoping you do not cause a scene and humiliate us. "Give me the briefcase with the cash, hand over the files right now, and get out of here before you ruin your sister's night." She reached out with her free hand, frantically trying to snatch the black clutch from my grasp. I took a smooth, calculated step back, effortlessly evading her reach. I did not yell. I did not cry. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel small, invisible, and inadequate, and I smiled. It was the same cold, unforgiving smile I had practiced in the hotel mirror. "I do not have the briefcase," I whispered, my voice dripping with absolute chilling certainty. "And I am not going anywhere." Without waiting for her to process the words, I pulled my arm free from her grip, turned my back on my mother, and walked directly toward the main stage. I left my mother standing in the shadows, her panicked demands dissolving into the low hum of the string quartet playing near the entrance. I walked directly into the center of the ballroom. The Biltmore was a cathedral of old money, with its soaring hand-painted ceilings and massive crystal chandeliers casting a warm golden glow over the crowd. Waiters in immaculate white coats circulated with silver trays of caviar and vintage champagne. It was a monument to excess funded entirely by the systematic destruction of communities like mine. The crimson silk of my dress caught the light, forcing the crowd of dark suits and muted evening gowns to part around me. I was not hiding in a service elevator. I was not shrinking into the background. I moved through the room with the precise, deliberate pacing of a woman walking to the executioner's block, and I was holding the axe. I spotted Preston near the open bar at the base of the main stage. He was holding a crystal tumbler of scotch, surrounded by a tight, exclusive cluster of older, gray-haired men in incredibly expensive tuxedos. These were the apex predators, the board of Vanguard Developments, the men whose massive equity investments were currently floating in offshore dummy accounts under Preston's direct control. As I approached, Preston's eyes locked onto me. He expected a broken, terrified woman, clutching a briefcase of hush money sneaking through the kitchen in sweatpants. Instead, he saw me. I saw the brief flash of pure, unadulterated panic in his expression before his slick corporate mask slammed back into place. He quickly stepped forward, attempting to intercept me before I could reach the inner circle, but I was faster. I slid right past his outstretched arm and stepped seamlessly into his group of investors. Preston had no choice but to follow, forced to maintain his charming facade in front of the men who controlled his funding. "Gentlemen," Preston said, his voice dripping with forced joviality, his hand clamping down on my bare shoulder with a bruising warning force. "This is Zuri, Chloe's younger sister." He paused, delivering the carefully calibrated insult designed to instantly diminish my credibility in their eyes. "We try to keep her involved in family events. She has had a rough time lately struggling with employment. We consider her our little charity case. It is important to support family when they cannot support themselves." The men chuckled, swirling their drinks with polite, condescending amusement. A tall man with a silver mustache and a patronizing smile stepped forward. I recognized him instantly from my forensic research. He was Arthur Sterling, the primary equity partner for Vanguard Developments, the man who had personally fronted the millions Preston was currently laundering. "Ah, the Washington family," Arthur said, looking at me as if I were a charity exhibit. "Preston has told us all about the situation on Auburn Avenue. You must be so incredibly grateful to have a man like him stepping in. That area has been plagued by urban decay for decades. It takes real vision to come in and uplift your people like this." "Uplift my people," I repeated, my voice perfectly level, my eyes boring into his. "Exactly," another investor chimed in, adjusting his silk tie. "It is a shame what happens to these historic neighborhoods when the local communities lack the financial literacy to maintain them. Your grandfather held on to that real estate far longer than he should have. It was dragging the property values of the entire district down. Preston is practically performing a public service, rescuing your family from bankruptcy and cleaning up the blight. It is a wonderful thing bringing a civilized corporate structure to a place that desperately needs it." I heard the old man finally lost his faculties. A third man added, shaking his head with mock sympathy, "It is a blessing, really. Now the adults can step in and make the hard, profitable decisions without all that emotional attachment getting in the way." They spoke about my grandfather's life's work as if it were a disease. They spoke about a thriving, generational black commercial district as if it were a wasteland waiting to be conquered and civilized by their superior capital. They stood there drinking champagne bought with stolen money, lecturing me on financial literacy, while praising the man who was actively robbing them blind. The sheer towering audacity of their racially charged microaggressions would have broken me a month ago. Tonight it just fueled the fire. Preston tightened his grip on my shoulder, his fingers digging painfully into my collarbone. He leaned down, his breath hot against my ear. "Give me the drive right now," he whispered fiercely, his voice completely dropping the charm. "Hand it over, or I swear to God, I will ruin you." I ignored him entirely. I did not flinch. I stood my ground, feeling the hard edges of the titanium flash drive pressing against the inside of my black evening clutch. I looked directly at Arthur Sterling. "Zuri is just here to enjoy the catering," Preston said loudly, trying to steer me away from the group. "She is not really equipped to understand the complexities of corporate revitalization. We should let her go find a table before she gets overwhelmed." "I am perfectly equipped, Preston," I said easily, shrugging off his heavy hand. I turned my attention back to the investors, my tone incredibly bright and conversational. "I understand completely. Preston is doing something truly unprecedented with the Auburn Avenue project. He has completely revolutionized the concept of capital allocation." Arthur smiled, taking another sip of his scotch, completely missing the sharp underlying sarcasm. "He certainly has. Vanguard is leading the charge in urban redevelopment. We are very proud of the capital we have committed to this initiative." I looked Arthur dead in the eye, my smile turning sweet and absolutely lethal. "Preston is definitely doing something unforgettable with your money tonight." Arthur's smile faltered. He lowered his glass, looking confused, glancing between me and his golden boy developer. The easy, arrogant atmosphere of the circle suddenly vanished, replaced by a cold, sudden tension. Preston's face dropped, the color completely draining from his cheeks as the horrifying reality of my words finally clicked into place. Arthur blinked, glancing between us with a slow, confused frown. Unforgettable. What exactly do you mean by that, young lady? Preston did not let me answer. His hand, previously a heavy weight on my shoulder, suddenly clamped down with bruising, desperate force. He let out a loud, entirely manufactured laugh that sounded more like a frantic bark. Sibling rivalry. Arthur Preston interrupted, his voice strained, but pitched loud enough to forcefully cover any response I might give. Zuri has a terribly dark sense of humor. Please excuse us for a moment. Family matters require my immediate attention. Before Arthur could process the deeply awkward exchange, Preston was practically dragging me away from the circle of investors. His grip on my upper arm was genuinely painful, his fingers digging into my muscle as he steered me through the sea of evening gowns and tailored suits. Chloe materialized beside us a second later, her face pale beneath her heavy contour, falling perfectly into step as Preston navigated us toward the back of the grand ballroom. He shoved open a set of heavy brass-studded double doors leading into a private VIP anteroom. The moment the thick oak doors clicked shut behind us, cutting off the polite hum of the gala, the polished, benevolent corporate savior completely vanished. Preston shoved me hard into the center of the room. I stumbled backward on my heels, but managed to keep my balance, my crimson silk dress swirling around my legs. Chloe immediately engaged the deadbolt on the double doors, sealing us inside the dimly lit mahogany-paneled space. "What exact game do you think you are playing out there?" Preston snarled, his voice dropping into a vicious guttural hiss. The charming smile was entirely gone, replaced by a contorted mask of pure rage. The vein in his neck pulsed visibly against his starched white collar. "You think you can walk into my gala stand in front of my primary equity partners and run your mouth? I paid you $50,000 to disappear, Zuri." I smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from my skirt, maintaining my absolute icy composure. "I did not take your money, Preston. It is sitting in the trunk of my car. I told you I was bringing the master drive tonight, and here I am." "You are an absolute nightmare!" Chloe shrieked, marching toward me with her hands balled into tight fists. Her diamond tennis necklace flashed under the recessed lighting, a glittering testament to the fraud we were standing in the middle of. "You could not stand it, could you? You could not stand watching us succeed while you have absolutely nothing. You are a disgusting, jealous spinster who cannot bear the fact that I married a visionary while you are destined to die alone in some cramped apartment." "Chloe," I said softly, looking at my sister with a mixture of pity and revulsion. "Your visionary husband is bankrupt. He is a criminal." "Shut your mouth!" Chloe snapped, her voice echoing shrilly off the dark wood walls. "You know nothing about how the real world operates. Preston is doing what needs to be done to secure our legacy. He is making the hard business decisions that weak people like you and Grandpa are too scared to make. You are just trying to ruin my marriage because you are bitter. You want to drag me down to your pathetic, miserable level. Give him the drive, Zuri. Hand over the files right now and get out of my sight before I have security throw you onto the street." Preston stepped forward, completely closing the distance between us. He loomed over me, using his height as a physical threat, his chest heaving. The smell of expensive cologne and stale scotch radiated off his skin. "I am done playing with you," Preston said, extending an open, demanding palm. "I have security guards stationed outside every exit. I have the zoning commissioner sitting at my table. I own this city tonight. Hand over the encrypted drive with Desmond's files right this second, or I will personally ensure you spend the next 10 years buried in so much retaliatory corporate litigation you will not be able to afford a cup of coffee. Give me the drive." I stared into his bloodshot, furious eyes. I let the silence stretch, allowing his panic to fester and bloom in the quiet room. Then, moving with deliberate, agonizing slowness, I unclasped my black evening clutch. I reached inside and pulled out the sleek, heavy titanium flash drive. Preston snatched it from my fingers with the frantic greed of a starving man. He let out a harsh, ragged breath of relief, stepping away from me and practically running toward a polished side table where his silver presentation laptop was resting. Chloe followed close behind him, hovering over his shoulder like a protective vulture. "You are a fool, Zuri," Preston muttered, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he woke the computer from sleep mode. "You actually had me worried for a second. You had all the leverage in the world, and you just handed it over because you are too weak to pull the trigger." He jammed the titanium drive into the side port of the laptop. I stood silently in the center of the room, watching the glow of the screen illuminate their greedy, desperate faces. Preston rapidly clicked through his file directory, hunting for the master folder containing his fraudulent ledgers, the offshore routing numbers, and the undeniable proof of his embezzlement scheme. But as the drive window popped open on the screen, his frantic clicking abruptly stopped. The folder was completely empty, save for a single standalone document. "What is this?" Preston breathed, his voice suddenly hollow. "Open it," I suggested quietly. Preston's hand trembled slightly as he dragged the cursor over the file and clicked. A high-resolution PDF expanded to fill the entire monitor. It was not a corporate ledger. It was not a blackmail dossier. It was a legally recorded, officially notarized warranty deed stamped with the unmistakable seal of the Fulton County Municipal Court. Preston stared at the screen, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. Chloe leaned in closer, her brow furrowing in confusion as she tried to decipher the document. I took a slow, measured step toward them. "That is the deed to the Sweet Auburn commercial block," I stated, my voice ringing with absolute ringing finality in the quiet room. "Grandpa did not sign a power of attorney over to you last week, Preston. Desmond forged that document, and even if he had signed it, it would not matter. Grandpa legally transferred the sole ownership of that entire property directly to me 6 months ago." Preston gripped the edges of the table, his knuckles turning stark white as the words registered. "Your forged eviction notices are worthless," I continued, moving to stand right beside him, looking down at the screen. "Your demolition permits are invalid. That entire $1 million racketeering scheme you built relies on seizing a property you do not own from a man who no longer holds the deed. I am the sole legal owner of the Auburn Avenue block, and I am never selling it to you." Preston's face drained of the last residual trace of color, turning a sickly ashen gray under the harsh fluorescent lighting of the anteroom. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The sheer, terrifying reality of his situation had finally breached his fortress of arrogance. The bank would seize his mansion by Friday morning. The Securities and Exchange Commission would uncover the millions he had siphoned into dummy corporations to fund the bribes and his lavish lifestyle. He had leveraged everything he owned against a property he had absolutely zero legal claim to. Chloe, still staring blankly at the glowing laptop screen, let out a low, whimpering gasp as she read the dense legal text and finally understood that her diamonds, her luxury cars, and her entire manufactured elite existence were completely gone. I did not wait for the screaming to start. I turned on my stiletto heel and walked out of the heavy oak doors, pulling them shut behind me and leaving them trapped in the airtight coffin of their own making. The corridor leading back to the grand ballroom was lined with thick velvet drapes and gilded mirrors. I strode past my own reflection, the crimson silk of my gown flowing behind me like a banner of war. As I pushed back out into the main hall, the noise of the gala washed over me. A jazz band was playing a smooth, upbeat tempo from the corner balcony. Waiters in immaculate white coats were balancing silver trays of caviar and pouring vintage champagne. The elite of Atlanta were completely oblivious to the fact that the man they were here to celebrate was currently hyperventilating in a back room, his financial empire reduced to digital dust. I kept my gaze fixed, dead ahead, locked onto the massive mahogany stage dominating the far end of the room. A sleek, acrylic podium stood in the center, flanked by 2 towering projection screens, currently displaying the glossy, animated renderings of the Vanguard luxury lofts. This was the stage where Preston was supposed to deliver his keynote address, where he was going to announce the hostile corporate takeover of our family's legacy. I began to weave through the crowd, my pace relentless. Conversations faltered as I passed. Arthur Sterling and his circle of investors paused their networking, their brows furrowing in confusion as they recognized the woman who had just delivered that chilling warning minutes earlier. I did not stop to explain. I bypassed the front row of VIP tables, the crisp white tablecloths adorned with elaborate floral centerpieces, and headed straight for the carpeted stairs leading up to the platform. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Desmond, the corrupt attorney who had orchestrated the forged power of attorney for Preston, was standing near the catering entrance. His face was slick with sweat, his eyes bulging as he tracked my trajectory. He knew exactly what was supposed to be on the flash drive I had brought, and seeing me march toward the stage instead of out the service elevator sent him into a blind panic. He lunged forward desperately, trying to cut through the dense crowd, knocking a tray of champagne flutes from a waiter's hand in his frantic haste. On the opposite side of the room, my mother Patricia suddenly realized what was happening. She had been holding court with the mayor's wife, projecting the image of the perfect, refined matriarch. I saw the exact second her composure shattered. She dropped her crystal glass, the shatter lost in the ambient noise, and began waving frantically at the perimeter security team. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at me, her face contorted in an ugly mask of sheer social terror. "Give us the files and get out of here before you ruin your sister's night," she had hissed at me earlier. She had no idea the files were already delivered, and the night was already ruined. Two bulky men in dark suits immediately detached themselves from the walls and moved toward the stage, their hands reaching for the earpieces wired into their collars. They were too late. I was already taking the steps two at a time. I stepped up to the acrylic podium, grasping the edges with both hands. I reached into my clutch, pulled out my phone, and tapped the single command Victoria Sterling had programmed for me. Above me, the massive digital banners displaying the fake luxury lofts flickered and died, instantly replaced by the stark, undeniable image of the warranty deed proving my legal ownership, completely hijacking the hotel's visual servers. The microphone was live, humming with a low, latent energy. I looked out over the sea of wealthy developers, politicians, and socialites. Hundreds of faces turned upward, expecting Preston Washington's charming lies. They got me instead. I leaned into the microphone. I did not tap it. I did not ask for their attention. I simply spoke, my voice echoing through the massive ballroom speakers with crystal clear, undeniable authority. "Excuse me." The jazz band abruptly stopped playing. The low roar of networking and polite laughter died in an instant, replaced by a sudden heavy silence that suffocated the room. The security guards who had been advancing toward the stage froze in their tracks, paralyzed by the sudden quiet, and unsure of how to physically handle a woman who was technically the host's sister-in-law, standing boldly in front of the governor. Desmond was frozen near table 4, his face buried in his hands. Patricia was standing completely still, her eyes squeezed shut in absolute horror. I swept my gaze across the crowd, making direct eye contact with Arthur Sterling, who was staring up at me with rapt, utterly confused attention. "Good evening. I am the sole legal owner of the historic property Vanguard Developments is claiming to acquire tonight, and I am here to announce that it is officially protected as a state heritage site. It will never be sold, and it will never be demolished." Preston snapped out of his paralyzed shock, letting out a feral roar that echoed horribly across the silent ballroom. He shoved past a bewildered waiter, sending a tray of glassware crashing to the floor, and sprinted toward the stage. His polished aristocratic veneer was entirely destroyed, replaced by the frantic desperation of a cornered animal. He reached the bottom step, his hand outstretched to rip the microphone from my grip. Before his immaculate leather shoe could hit the second step, a tall man in a sharp charcoal suit stepped out from the wings, blocking his path entirely. This was Marcus Vance, one of the most ruthless corporate litigators in Atlanta, and I had hired him on a premium retainer 3 days ago. Marcus casually but firmly pressed a thick stack of legal documents into Preston's chest, forcing the developer to halt his aggressive advance. These were federal injunctions. Marcus stated, his voice carrying clearly to the front row, legally freezing every single asset, bank account, and property tied to Vanguard Developments. Preston stumbled backward, as if he had been physically struck, staring down at the papers in his hands. I did not even look at him. I kept my absolute focus on the front row of VIP tables. Arthur Sterling and the other board members were staring at me in stunned silence, their vintage champagne glasses frozen halfway to their mouths. I leaned closer to the microphone, letting my voice ring out over the panicked murmurs beginning to ripple through the sea of evening gowns and tailored suits. Furthermore, I announced, ensuring my tone was perfectly level and professional. As a certified forensic accountant, I feel a strict obligation to inform the primary equity partners in this room about the actual state of your investments. Preston Washington has not been funneling your venture capital into Auburn Avenue or any other urban revitalization project. He has been systematically using your money to cover his personal, highly illegal cross-collateralized debts. He is completely bankrupt, and your funds have already vanished into offshore dummy corporations to pay off his creditors. A collective gasp erupted from the apex predators. Arthur dropped his crystal tumbler entirely. It shattered against the table, spilling amber liquid across the pristine white linen. I am not just speaking as a concerned property owner. I continued watching the color drain from their aristocratic faces. I have spent the last month tracing every single wire transfer, forged signature, and fraudulent invoice. Exactly 45 minutes ago, the FBI Cybercrimes Unit received my complete unredacted audit of Vanguard developments. Right on cue, the faint but unmistakable wail of approaching sirens drifted through the massive arched windows of the Biltmore. The sound multiplied and grew louder by the second, cutting sharply through the heavy tension in the hall. Arthur and the men around him frantically plunged their hands into their tuxedo pockets, pulling out their smartphones. The ballroom instantly erupted into absolute unbridled chaos. Men began shouting in pure panic, frantically refreshing their screens as they stared at the terrifying reality of completely frozen portfolios and locked equity accounts. The ballroom dissolved into a symphony of absolute panic. Arthur Sterling threw his shattered crystal glass to the floor and lunged toward the stage, his face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. Men in tailored tuxedos were shouting frantically into their cell phones, desperately trying to reach their wealth managers, while others physically cornered the Vanguard board members. The Biltmore Gala, designed to be a coronation of Preston Washington's brilliance, had instantly transformed into a crime scene. I stood motionless at the podium, watching the exact moment the illusion shattered. If this were a movie, the camera would be circling the stage in a continuous, dizzying loop, capturing the simultaneous collapse of every single lie my family had built their lives upon. Chloe was the first to completely crack. She had been staring at her phone screen, her manicured thumbs swiping frantically, as alert after alert populated her lock screen. Her bank accounts were inaccessible. Her credit lines were instantly suspended. She scrambled up the stage stairs, her heavy silk gown catching under her heels, and grabbed Preston by the lapels of his ruined tuxedo. "What did you do?" Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking over the roar of the crowd. "The bank just sent an automated foreclosure alert to my phone. Preston, what did you do to our house?" Preston tried to shove her hands away, his eyes darting wildly toward the exits. He was looking for an escape route that no longer existed. "I had to secure the mezzanine funding," he barked, his voice laced with venom. "I leveraged the Buckhead estate. I leveraged the cars. I cross-collateralized everything we owned against the Auburn Avenue development to keep the dummy accounts full until the demolition went through." "You signed the secondary mortgage papers yourself, Chloe. You thought you were signing a tax write-off." "You put my house against a stolen deed!" Chloe screamed, her perfectly contoured face contorting into a mask of pure horror. Her hands flew to her diamond tennis necklace as if it were suddenly choking her. "We are millions of dollars in debt. You bankrupt us. You ruined my life. I did what I had to do to keep you dripping in diamonds," Preston roared back, completely dropping his polished, gentle giant persona. He violently pushed past his weeping wife and pointed a shaking finger directly at Desmond. The corrupt attorney was currently trying to slink off the back of the stage, his briefcase clutched to his chest like a shield. "Do not let him leave," Preston shouted to the paralyzed security guards. "This is his fault. Desmond is the one who drafted the fake power of attorney. He sold me a bad deed. He assured me the old man was legally incapacitated and that the transfer was bulletproof. He is the one who set up the offshore routing. Desmond froze, surrounded by furious investors blocking his path. He spun around, his face slick with sweat, and pointed straight at my mother. "Do not put this on me," Desmond yelled, his voice echoing through the microphone I had left resting on the podium. Patricia orchestrated the entire timeline. She was the one who kept the grandfather isolated. She swore she had full control over the estate and that the younger daughter had been completely cut out of the family trust. She promised me a 20% stake in the Vanguard acquisition if I pushed the paperwork through the municipal court blind. Patricia looked as though the floor had vanished beneath her feet. The wealthy socialites and political allies she had spent decades cultivating were now staring at her with undisguised disgust. Her immaculate reputation, her carefully curated image of the refined, benevolent matriarch, was disintegrating in real time. "You incompetent fool!" Patricia shrieked, marching toward Desmond with her hands curled into claws. "I paid you to handle the legalities quietly. I paid you to make sure that senile old man could not interfere with our legacy. You ruined my family. You destroyed my daughter's marriage. You destroyed it yourself." Patricia Desmond spat back, backing away from her advancing fury. "You handed your family over to a con artist because you liked the way his bank account looked on paper." The sound of heavy boots and crackling police radios suddenly drowned out the chaotic shouting. Uniformed officers and federal agents were flooding into the grand ballroom through every set of double doors, their badges flashing under the crystal chandeliers. The FBI Cybercrimes Unit did not waste any time. Patricia saw the federal windbreakers moving toward the stage. The sheer, towering reality of federal prison finally fractured her deep-seated narcissism. Her knees buckled slightly, and she spun around, her eyes locking onto me. I was still standing perfectly still, watching the vultures devour each other. She rushed across the stage, her expensive evening gown dragging across the floor, her flawless makeup smeared with desperate tears. She reached out and grabbed my bare arms, her manicured nails digging into my skin just as Preston's had done earlier. "Zuri, please!" Patricia begged, her voice dropping into a frantic, sobbing whisper. She looked at the police advancing up the steps and then back at me, her eyes wide with a terror I had never seen her display. "Please, you have to stop this. Tell them it is a misunderstanding. Tell them it was a corporate oversight. You have the real deed, you can fix this. We can give you whatever you want. We are family, Zuri. You cannot send your own sister's husband to prison. You cannot do this to your mother. We are family." I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel invisible. I looked at the mother who had gladly tried to steal her own father's legacy to fund a fraudulent empire. I did not pull away. I simply stared at her with absolute, unwavering clarity. "You told me family does not cause drama." I said, my voice quiet, cold, and echoing with the finality of a slamming vault door. "Consider me out of the drama." I pulled my arms free from her desperate grasp, leaving my mother standing alone on a stage she had helped turn into a crime scene. I did not look back. I walked down the center aisle of the Biltmore Ballroom with the exact same measured, deliberate pacing I had used when I entered. The sea of panicked investors, screaming executives, and terrified socialites parted for me one last time. As I reached the heavy brass doors, a squad of federal agents in tactical windbreakers rushed past me, moving swiftly to apprehend the Golden Boy developer who was currently attempting to flee through the kitchen loading dock. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated my face as I stepped out into the cool Atlanta night air. That chaotic, pulsing glow smoothly transitions into the warm, golden afternoon sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my current living room. 6 months have passed since the Vanguard Gala collapsed into a swarm of federal indictments. Preston, Washington is currently serving a 15-year sentence in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering. The bank seized absolutely everything. Chloe's tennis necklaces, her luxury imported cars, and her sprawling Buckhead mansion were completely liquidated at federal auction. My sister now lives in a cramped one-bedroom apartment and works the perfume counter at a mid-tier department store. It is a brutal, exhausting reality check for a woman who truly believed her manufactured elite status made her untouchable. Desmond was permanently disbarred and is facing his own impending prison sentence for forging legal documents. Patricia is a total social pariah. The elite circles she worshipped completely exiled her the moment the scandal broke, and she is currently drowning in massive mounting legal fees just trying to keep herself out of a federal cell. They destroyed their own lives chasing a counterfeit legacy. I walk out of my newly designed workspace and step directly onto the wide wraparound porch of the freshly renovated Sweet Auburn commercial block. The street is absolutely thriving, buzzing with local business owners, vibrant storefronts, and the undeniable energy of a community that flatly refused to be erased. I am now the CEO of my own highly successful forensic accounting firm, operating right here out of the flagship building my grandfather built. Sitting on the porch in the afternoon sun is Grandpa Ezekiel. His recovery over the last 6 months has been nothing short of miraculous. He rests comfortably in his wheelchair, breathing easily on his own, his eyes sharp and bright as he watches the neighborhood he dedicated his life to continue to flourish. He spots me and smiles, a genuine, immensely proud expression that means more to me than any corporate accolade or bank balance ever could. I rest my hand gently on his shoulder, feeling the solid living proof of our family's true history. I look out at the bustling street and then turn my gaze directly toward the camera as it begins to slowly pull back into the shadows. They wanted to bulldoze my legacy to build their fake empire, so I buried them in the rubble.